Chapter 1 Death. My life has been normal, so to speak. It's the year 2024, I'm about to graduate from high school, I'm 17 years old and my name is Danny, but I am what many would call a social misfit. I'm not afraid of public speaking or participating in classes or anything like that. But it's just that, I don't know how to relate to people no matter how I do it. Most of the time I always end up making people around me uncomfortable with my stupidities or senseless things. Despite everything, I have good grades if that's something to brag about. I don't have a person I can call a real friend. I only have 2 classmates who put up with me in class, although I can see that they're starting to dislike me. Sigh, I would like to start over and make a better life. I murmured. Did you say something? A classmate next to me said with confusion. Nothing, I'm just studying. What do I do? I stuttered as I stood up from my seat. My classmate looked at me with confusion, but thanks to my annoying personality, he didn't bother to continue insisting. Shit, that was close. Yes. In short, my current life is shit. And don't come to me with that, no, thing. Your parents will be sad if you decide to end your life. You will go to hell. Bullshit. My mother died at my birth and my father blames me for it, and that's why he doesn't give a shit about me. He also remarried and is happy with his new wife and children. The bastard barely remembers me. But I've tried. I've tried hard to get ahead. I even asked to change schools when I went from 2nd to 3rd grade in high school to start over. My mindset was, if they don't know you, you can start over, make friends and even have a girlfriend. But no. My shitty personality ruins everything, and I don't consider myself ugly or anything like that. I even trained in the gym for years to improve my physique, but that didn't help at all. Sometimes I look at my peers of the same age with jobs, girlfriends and money, which makes me feel like shit. And before you tell me something, yes, I tried to work and as always I failed. I tried to work at a hamburger stand, then as an upholsterer's assistant, then as a street sweeper, and finally I tried to be a dishwasher in a restaurant. But as always I failed. Maybe it's something I transmit or the way I act or something in me that always drives away the people I try to be friends with. After years I just stopped trying and I'm not even 18 yet. And if that weren't enough, I'm a virgin. Yes, a virgin at 17. I didn't even touch my mother's tits since she died, so I'm a total failure. The truth is I would like to go back in time and do it all again. But I know that is impossible. Hey, watch where you walk, dog, the class bully said as I hurriedly returned home. I didn't take it seriously and kept walking, thanks heavens for my genetics since I'm 1.85 meters tall, which saves me from being a victim of bullying, but that doesn't save me from being considered the weird one in the classroom. I can't even be on the street because people are always staring at me, which makes me feel extremely uncomfortable, and even worse with my father and his wife. My brothers and sisters treat me like shit and my only consolation is doing housework. Yes, I enjoy cleaning the house and that is why my father has not kicked me out of the house, although I can feel that when I turn 18 he will do it immediately. I rushed home and walked through the door only to be greeted with a look of disdain from my younger stepsister. Shit, Dan is back. She screamed throughout the house, tell that annoying piece of shit to wash the dishes. My father shouted from the living room. I could only clench my fists in anger at this. Besides suppressing the urge to beat my stepsister to death, who always gave me that fucking look of disdain and that malicious smile. After washing the dishes I swept and mopped the house. Also my father sent me to sweep the front yard, which took me all afternoon, but after hours I managed to do it. Seeing my progress today, my father didn't say anything and stopped giving me orders for the day. Hiya! Finally! I muttered as I walked back into the house towards my room. Thank goodness I have my own room, although it's not that great. Still, my room is my sacred place and where I can enjoy the view of the world for a few moments. Now, comes the best part of the day. I murmured yes. Even with this shitty life I can have moments of peace. I locked the door to my room and from under my bed I took out a book the size of a dictionary. Mushoku Tensei, said the title. Mwak? I kissed the cover of the booklet with the payments I received from my job. I was able to save up to buy the first 12 volumes of the novel. And yes, despite living in Mexico, I am what could be considered an anime connoisseur. Not an otaku since they are more bothered than me, although it sounds very pathetic. This book has gotten me out of many troubles and has given me laughter and relief over the years. Although its animated adaptation leaves much to be desired. But it was still enjoyable. I looked at my watch and it was 7:45 in the evening, the sky was already dark and I could already have my moment of relaxation. I lay down on the bed and opened volume number 9 of the novel. I've always loved the Sylphie and Rudeus reunion episodes. It's the most touching shit I've ever read. Is your real name Sylphiette by any chance? Yes. Fitz, or rather, Sylphie, smiled shyly and nodded. Yes, it is. I'm Sylphiette. Sylphiette, from Buena Village. After a few seconds, emotion took over her and her smile crinkled and disappeared. Before she completely collapsed, she managed to lean forward and put her arms around me. Finally, I finally said it. This shit is so peak, I murmured as a lone tear ran down my face. Even a loser like me has feelings, you know. Sigh. Shit, what will it feel like to have your own Sylphie? I muttered as I settled down to sleep. In addition to the novels, I had saved enough money to buy a phone, even if it was a Motorola brand, and there I have the 26 novels and the redundancies. I could tell you any part of the novel why it seems like that anime is my Bible. It was already 9:20 at night and I liked to sleep. I put the book under my bed, turned off the light in my room. I set an alarm for 6:30 in the morning and I lay down on my side in bed. After about 15 minutes I could feel myself falling asleep when suddenly, knock, knock, knock. Danny, go get me a beer. And bring pizza for your brothers to eat. My father shouted from the door, making me jump in fright. I put my pillow on my face and let out a scream of anger. I got up and found my father in front of me. Thanks to puberty I had grown taller than my stepbrothers, but I was still slightly shorter than my father. What kind of shitty look is that? Hurry up. My father demanded as he handed me the money. I was falling asleep. I muttered as I took the money, I don't care, hurry up, I'm hungry, he said as he walked down the stairs. I could only clench my fists in anger at this as I watched my father walk down the stairs. Without being able to object or anything like that, I left the house in the direction of the store. It was already mid-December, so winter was near. In this part of Mexico it never snows and instead it pours with rain. I had my usual sweater on and it started raining halfway to the store. Shit. I muttered as I walked down the sidewalk. I arrived at a pizzeria that was about 5 blocks from my house and ordered 3 pizzas. Obviously I wouldn't get a single slice, but it wasn't something I could complain about. After waiting for 20 minutes the pizzas were delivered and so I walked to a local bar. The owner of the bar knew me as Danny, Alejandro's failed son, his best client. Just by seeing me approach the bar, the owner already knew what my father wanted to drink, so he would just arrive, drink the beer and pay. Thank goodness the rain had stopped so I wouldn't get any wetter than I already was. I walked about 3 blocks until I saw a couple of kids throwing fireworks in the street. This is already a tradition in the country since they even started in November. But the fools even went too far and threw doves, a powerful triangular-shaped pyrotechnic that was more dangerous depending on its size. I don't know if I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, but the damn brats threw a dove about 30 centimeters long that exploded under a truck. The truck's tire burst and the truck driver lost control of the vehicle. In less than a second the truck's trajectory changed and it hit me squarely, crushing me with a sidewalk. I didn't feel any pain or anything like that. It was so fast that I didn't even have time to process what happened. Pizzas and beers spilled onto the floor as I was crushed from the inside by the truck. I was pinned between the truck and a wall as blood poured out of my mouth. I could hear the screams of gossipy old women and some men shouting, "Call an ambulance." I couldn't listen anymore and my consciousness went out. I could see my life flash before my eyes and it was disappointing. It was more painful than the crash itself. I didn't even say any final words and I just died. Chapter 2 Reincarnation. My consciousness vanished in the blink of an eye. At least I would have liked to stand out in this world. I thought as darkness invaded me. A few moments passed and there was only darkness, no light at the end of the tunnel nor a burning door beneath me. Only darkness. Shit. The atheists were right, huh? I thought, but a moment later I felt a force pulling me towards nothingness. It was like I was being pushed forward from my back. What language is that? Asterisk 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 asterisk. From the darkness I could hear a distant scream. I felt a huge headache, and when I opened my eyes I was in a cabin. I woke up in some kind of cabin, or so I thought. My vision was blurry and my body felt weak. I tried to speak, but only strange guttural noises came out of my throat. However, I felt like someone was carrying me and caressing me. That person's hands were soft, and they treated me delicately. I tried to look at the surroundings, but I could only see shadows and their murmurs in a language that I did not recognize. I felt how I was changed from arms and passed into hard and rough hands. They caressed my hair in a somewhat abrupt manner, and I could hear a feminine murmur that I could not recognize. I was immediately returned to the feminine hands, and the shadows continued murmuring, but I could not understand anything. About 30 minutes passed, and I felt extremely exhausted for no reason and fell asleep. The next day was more of the same. The shadows were murmuring things that I couldn't understand, and my body felt extremely weak. At first I thought I was in a hospital or something like that, but all my doubts were cleared up when I felt a woman's breasts on my face the next day, and instinctively I started drinking the milk. There was no point in continuing to look for more explanations. He had been reincarnated, and I didn't know where until my vision adjusted. I couldn't know where I was. 2 weeks passed or so, I think, and finally my vision adjusted. I was in a kind of rustic wooden house inside a kind of crib that was actually a wooden box with sheets on top. These 2 weeks were about trying to find out where I was. It seemed to be a rustic house, but through the window next to the room I could see snowy pine trees, which gave me an idea that I could be in medieval Europe. My new mother was a woman with strong blue hair and eyes. She had a toned appearance for a woman, and she always carried me in her arms throughout the house. My father, on the other hand, was a very tall and muscular man with brown hair. He had a scar on his cheek and always carried a divinely decorated sword at his waist. I didn't want to believe what I thought, but the more I was in this new world, the harder it was to think. The straw that broke the camel's back was hearing my mother always call my father Timothy, and also, today a blue-haired man with a black fur coat came to visit us, a beautiful sword at his waist, just like my father, a vertical scar on his cheek, a blue goatee, and an air of confidence. There was no doubt. I had seen this guy in the illustrations of my favorite anime. He was Gulfun, and he was my mother's brother, for which I had been reborn as Gino Britzes. It's been exactly a month since I was reincarnated. There was no doubt. I had reincarnated in the world of Mushoku Tensei, my favorite anime and novel. At first, I tried to look for a logical explanation, but when I saw my father and Gull sparring with swords at a speed that I couldn't react to, then saw my father lying on the floor with a huge cut on his face, his chest, while he was bleeding, and after all that, being cured with healing magic in the blink of an eye. Shit. It was too good to be true. After having a shitty life in my life as Danny, I now had the opportunity to start over as Gino. The emotion was so great that I couldn't help but cry for hours, and not even my mother could console me. Today 2 months have passed since I was reincarnated as Gino. I still don't understand the language, but I learned my parents' name Timothy and Elia Britzes. The days were boring, so to speak. Most of the time I didn't leave my crib, and when I did it was being carried by my mother, and we never left the house. My favorite part of the day was when I and my mother watched my father practice with his sword in the yard. The sword practically blurred from view due to the speed. I could only admire this with my eyes wide open. He knew that being in Gino's body, he had an innate talent for the sword, and he wanted to take advantage of it. When I grow up enough, I want to dedicate myself to the sword. I mumbled to myself with a smile. Asterisk 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 asterisk? Apparently, my mother asked me something while looking at me with a smile. I'm sorry, Mom. I can't understand a damn thing you're saying. Nothing personal. My routine consisted of sleeping, waking up, shitting, drinking milk, watching Dad practice with the sword, shitting again, and sleeping. I had forgotten that the most boring part of reincarnating is when you are a baby, but it can't be helped. In addition to dedicating myself to the sword, I wanted to venture into magic. I had read Mushoku Tensei so many times to the point of memorizing several incantations. I also wanted to try magic without chanting, and I wanted to increase my mana reserves. In short, I want to be fucking up. If you're wondering, no, I don't miss my previous life as a loser, nor my shitty father or family. Sayonara, bastards. Now I am in this new life to be someone important. The only bad thing about this new world is the fucking cold. As a previous inhabitant of southern Mexico, 20 degrees Celsius was already considered cold. I don't know what time of year it is, I guess it's winter, but I doubt it because my parents wear light clothes despite the snowy surroundings. Also, what I did know is that this was the year K408, so I am 1 year younger than Rudeus. If he was born in this world, I don't know if he will be in this loop. I hope so. When I grow up, I would like to interact with him in some way, but that is still too far away, and I will leave everything to its time. It will still be a few years until I can hold a sword, so I want to experiment with increasing my mana reserves. The bad thing is that I didn't know Gino's magical potential. It was never mentioned in the novel, but I assume it is low, but I will follow Rudeus' example and increase my reserves. But there was a problem. I had no fucking idea how to do it. Manipulate your mana? Release it into the environment. What a joke. Yeah. I speak to you reincarnated realistically overpowerful. Even as a fan of Mushoku Tensei, I've read fanfics and none of them explain how the protagonists manipulate their mana. What a joke. Foo, concentrate Danny. No. Concentrate Gino? Yes. That's better. Nights might be my best time to practice my mana control, so if I pass out from exhaustion, my parents will just think I'm asleep. I tried to search my entire body and feel my mana. In short, I tried for hours but found absolutely nothing, and in the end I fell asleep due to fatigue. Stupid baby body. I tried to feel something for a whole week without any result. I got to the point of despair and gave up, but on the 6th day I felt something, a warm feeling in my chest. I tried to manipulate the sensation by directing it to my hand and thus expelling it from my body. It was like something warm came out of my hand. Did I make it? I didn't have time to think more and I fell unconscious. I woke up the next day as if nothing had happened, but I had succeeded in something. My mana pool was super tiny, but with enough work, I could at least raise it to the level of Roxy or similar. Although I will lean more towards the sword, I always imagine myself as a magical knight. During the next few days I found myself spending my minuscule mana reserves day by day, always falling unconscious on the spot. Even after a month my progress was not very noticeable. Gino didn't have much talent in magic, right? I have also made progress in the language, although very small. I already learned to recognize words like mom, dad, sword, food, sleep, and love. It's not much, but it's honest work. I've only been in this body for 3 months, and I also plan to live this life to the fullest. And for that, I need to be strong and cunning, things I'm not an expert in, but I'll try. Chapter 3 Learning. It's been about 6 months since I was reborn as Gino. Now I can understand parts of the language of this world, but the more complex words are difficult for me. But that makes me happy. If Rudeus' hypothesis is true, then this was the best time to develop new skills. Speaking of new skills, I have gradually increased my mana reserves. Before, I could get rid of everything in a second, but now it takes me 2 minutes to deplete my mana. It's not a big step forward considering all the time I've been doing it, but it's honest work. Thanks to my gradual belief, my mother took me to the central dojo for the first time yesterday. If I could describe the place with just one word, it would be crazy. The sounds of wooden swords clashing echoed throughout the venue, the students all sweaty and whiny trying to win their respective duels with a single blow. A curious fact is that only swordsmen of saint rank or higher can train in this place. Advanced and lower rank swordsmen use other minor dojos which are managed by my father, another sword emperor. The name of the other sword emperor was unknown to me as he was never mentioned in the novel, but I was able to identify the name of Samuel, so I guess that's his name. Gulfaran, how he always sits on his kind of throne in a central corner of the dojo, and from there he watches his students. And the reason why we are here? Well, a new sword king will be chosen today according to what my father told my mother, and that's why we are here. The candidates are a middle-aged guy named Adolf and a muscular beast woman with dark skin, long gray hair and a white patch over his right eye. Ghislaine Didoldia. She looked younger and a little more hyperactive than I remember, but it was natural. Besides, holy shit, I never thought she'd be here right now, but considering Mushoku's timeline, it makes sense. Damn, this chick is sexier than I thought. And fuck those tits. Damn Lucky Paul. I want to touch those tits too. Oh, you've never seen a beast woman before, have you, Gino? My mother said with a smile. Doing my best baby impression, I looked at her confused and she laughed. Hee. She comes from the great forest on the Millis continent. She said excitedly. Thanks, Mom, but I already knew that. Gulfaran called them both and they sat on the floor in front of him. Very well. You two have surpassed the threshold of sword saints and are close to being sword kings. Gulfaran declared excitedly. Adolf looked excited, and although Ghislaine looked serious, I could notice that her tail was moving from side to side and her ears were fully raised. And because of that, now you two will face each other and the one who wins will be named Sword King. Gulfarion continued with excitement. Ghislaine and Adolf nodded excitedly at this. They got up from the ground and both walked in opposite directions to stand face to face about 5 meters apart off each other. They both raised their wooden swords and got into combat stances. My father and Samuel stood on either side of Gulfaran to analyze the duel, and I was with my mother in the opposite corner. Very well, begin, Gul murmured. In the blink of an eye, Ghislaine's image disappeared from my sight just like Adolf's. But a second later a huge hole in the wall was formed in Adolf's direction. Ghislaine's image appeared in the same place where she was, but she had her sword unsheathed. I guess that was a light blade. The saint-rank swordsman went to see the hole, and there was Adolf lying on the floor unconscious. He's dead, one of the swordsmen said, but no one but me flinched, and as if that weren't enough, a smile appeared on Gul's face. Ghislaine just stared at the hole in the wall for a few moments and then looked at Gul. As expected, congratulations, Ghislaine, you can now call yourself Sword King, he said. Ghislaine also smiled and bowed respectfully to Gul. In that case, come with me. I will never tolerate a student of mine using his skills with just any sword, he said, and Ghislaine accompanied him to a room in the dojo. I looked at my mother and she seemed totally shocked at this exchange. My father, on the other hand, was talking to Samuel about something I couldn't hear, but they both had smiles on their faces. Shortly after, Gul and Ghislaine left the room, and Ghislaine was carrying her iconic red sword. Unfortunately, my mother did not come over to talk to her, so I could only delight from afar with those beautiful brown tits. And to my worst fortune, Ghislaine left the sacred land of the sword the next day. I guess I'll see you in 12 years, won't I, Ghislaine? I wailed with tears in my eyes, much to my mother's surprise. The days passed and I turned 10 months old. I could almost fully master the language. I could already crawl more easily than I could explore my house. Although there wasn't much, there were 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a living room with a fireplace, and a kitchen. On top of that, we had a front and backyard where Dad often trained. My father, as I mentioned before, is in charge of the advanced rank swordsmen in a secondary school, so he is only at home in the mornings and afternoons. To my surprise, my mother also trains with the sword, but only to stay in shape, as she only swings the sword and jogs in the yard when she thinks I'm asleep. If I could describe them both, it would be, for example, my father is a strict man, extremely strong and rarely affectionate. I rarely saw him at home, but I still respected him for his strength. My mother, on the other hand, was a calm woman who was at home all day. She was relaxed. She likes to play with me, but she doesn't pamper me too much, which I appreciate. I can't guess the range of my mother's sword, but it can't go beyond advanced, so I'll give her an intermediate level. My mana increase is going in baby steps. Still, if I try hard enough, I can get to a decent level before I turn 10, which is when mana reserves stop growing. But I was confident, with the innate potential of this body and my advances with my increase in mana, I could become someone powerful. But there was still too much time left before I could wield a sword. I'm just learning to walk and my mana is at minimum levels, but everything in its time. Another 2 months have passed and today I turned 1 year old. As always in this world, you only have birthdays on your 5th, 10th and 15th birthdays, so today was a day like any other, but not for me. I can already stammer some words after my constant practice. Obviously, in front of my mother, my first word was mama, which made her cry with joy, followed by daddy. To my dad, these small steps helped me move forward on the path to gaining my parents' affection. Also, with my constant improvement in my speech, I will finally be able to practice my magic. Combined with the effort I make every night to increase my mana reserves, I have no doubt that I could conjure at least a ball of water when I can speak fluently. My mother would also take me for a walk around the place so that I could get to know it, since according to the inhabitants of this world, taking a baby outside before it is 1 year old can be dangerous. And now that I think about it, the first and only time I left home was when I saw my goddess Ghislaine turn into a sword king. And on that occasion I was fully covered and my mother held me firmly to transmit her body heat to me. We spent part of the day walking around the place, and it gave me more the impression of being a disorganized village or city than anything else. But I was more attracted to the smaller dojo. In that place only children are trained and they leave the place when they become intermediates of the sword. And inside the training room I saw her. Nina Fo, the daughter of Gulfaran and therefore my cousin and future wife. Yes, you heard me right. She looked totally adorable brandishing her little wooden sword. She must be about 4 years old at this point, but I was surprised to see her determined look when it came to training. Look there, Gino. That's your cousin Nina. Say hello to her. Mama said while pointing at Nina with her finger. At this, Nina noticed us and stopped training. Auntie! Nina screamed as she hugged my mother. Nice to see you, darling. Look, this is your little cousin Gino. Say hello to him. Mom said as she brought me closer to Nina. Nina looked at me for a few moments and gently stroked my hair. It's small, Nina said with a smile. Well, yes. He's a baby, but he'll soon grow up and it will be your duty to take care of him, Nina. Mom said while looking Nina in the eyes. Nina looked at Mom and then looked at me and nodded with a smile. And after that we left the dojo and went back home. And that, my son, is how I met your mother. Ahem. I mean, that's how I met my cousin. When I got home, tiredness invaded me again because of this fucking baby body and I fell asleep again. But I already had many goals in mind: learning to use the sword, learn magic, learning to read, and marry Nina, but I think that will be a long-term goal. But I still had a lot to go through and experience, and I couldn't be more excited about it. Chapter 4. Still early. It's been a year since I met Nina, my future wife. Yeah, you know what I'm going to do. Now I can walk freely around my house without having to crawl or be carried by my mother. I have now completely mastered the language used here, something I am tremendously proud of. In my magical development, what can I say? It hasn't been as good as I had hoped, but it's something else. Now I need a total of 20 minutes to exhaust all my mana reserves by throwing them outside, but I don't know when I'll be ready to throw my first water ball. I haven't made any progress in swordsmanship yet, but now I can watch my father train in the mornings. First, I want to be at least elementary level in all magic levels before I start sword training. And in case you're wondering, right now I'm watching my father train. Another curious thing I realized is that I was born in the middle of summer. That is to say, my second birthday, which is today, is in the middle of summer. And just last night we had a snowstorm. Although I guess it can be understood since we are in the far north of the central continent or something like that. Watching my father train was not only fascinating but also entertaining. He swung the sword he always uses up and down with a perfectly calculated movement. When he lowers his sword, no part of his body moves except for his arms. The amount of precision and practice to achieve such control with the sword must be enormous. But I knew I could do that and more. My father's routine has remained unchanged even until now. He trains for an hour in the morning, goes to the dojo, returns home for dinner, and trains for an hour at night. To my surprise, Gul Farun comes to visit us, or rather to visit Mom once every 10 days, which leaves me surprised every time I see the guy. Even though he is my uncle and future father-in-law, Gul treats me with a certain indifference. I think that if I were not his nephew, he would ignore me completely. And it's not something out of the ordinary. Despite my curious glances, the guy just looks at me as if I were the most annoying thing in the world. But I also noticed that he has a lot of affection for his younger sister, considering that he comes to visit her. In the novel, it is never mentioned, but Gul only let my father marry Mom when he became a sword emperor, and he was already a close friend of Gul's before. Also, in one of those conversations, I heard that Gul just turned 23 years old. And my mother is 18 right now. And the worst thing is that my father is 30 years old. Strange, right? Although I guess that's not a problem in this world, so I let it go. My father's morning training was progressing smoothly, and I was watching him so intently that I didn't notice when my mother appeared behind me. "Are you interested in the sword, Gino?" Mom said with a smile on her face as she carried me. I put on my best innocent face and nodded that yes. I want to train with the sword to be as strong as Daddy, I said, emphasizing a childish tone at the end. My mother laughed lightly at this, and my father looked towards us, stopping his training. "So young and you already want to train? Are you sure you can handle it?" my father said as he wiped away his sweat. "Tim, he just turned 2 years old, it's too soon," my mother protested weakly. "Nonsense. The earlier he trains, the better he's going to be, and don't be stupid, we'll just start getting his body in shape before we train with the sword," my father replied as he lightly poked my stomach with the sword, which made me tickle. "It's okay," my mother said with resignation, but I could see concern on her face. Yes. To my surprise, my father is the one in charge. It was not something I was used to after seeing the family theme of the Greyrat family. Although the only thing that is not different is that my father dominates my mom in bed. Don't ask how I know that. And so when I was 2 years and 3 days old, I began my sword training routine with my father. Obviously, it was only jogging, strides, and stretching exercises like he said to get my body in shape. The first day was terribly exhausting. I was already used to exercising in my previous life, but for your information, this was the body of a 2-year-old baby. We could put him as if he were out of shape. That's how the first 2 weeks passed until I started to get used to it, so to speak. Furthermore, my mother always watched us with clear concern, but I always put on a determined face and never, oh well, I almost never complained about the exercises, so that relaxed her a little. Even when Dad went to the dojo, I continued training until I was exhausted from exhaustion. When this happened, Mom always ran to me to wipe my sweat and congratulate me on my success, which felt extremely good. Also, for the first time in a long time, when I was 2 years and 3 months old, Nina, my cousin and future wife, came to visit us. "Aunt!" she screamed as she entered the house. "Oh, Nina, what brings you here?" my father asked curiously. "I heard from Uncle Timothy that Gino started training," she said excitedly. My mother put on a complicated expression at this. It seems like that, but right now he's just getting his body in shape," Mom explained. "Never mind. I want to see how he does it," Nina responded. My mother looked at Nina with a weak smile as she guided her towards the backyard. There I was jogging around the yard to gain stamina. "Well, there he is. Don't be hard on him, okay?" Mom told Nina. She nodded while looking at me. I stopped running and looked at her while I caught my breath. "So you're already training, huh, little guy, hee hee," she said with a mocking smile. I didn't care and smiled at him. Yes. I train to be as strong as my father, I said, feigning enthusiasm. Nina looked at me with confusion and smiled. Hee hee, I guess the guy is strong. But my father is stronger, she said mockingly. I looked at her without reacting for a few moments and then I started jogging again. I know that, that's why I will train hard to defeat my father and then yours, I declared while jogging. At this, Nina looked at me with her eyes wide open and then smiled. Hee hee. I'm training to do it too, she said as she started jogging next to me. Incredible. What rank are you? I asked him. I'm just a beginner, but I'll get stronger as I grow, she declared with determination. So we continued doing cardio for a few minutes. Nina is stronger than me due to her age, and I was out of breath not long after. What's wrong, shorty? Can't you continue? She said with a teasing smile as she trotted around me. I'm younger than you, I replied breathlessly. That's true. But you'll have to catch up with me if you want to defeat me, she said mockingly. I just sighed at this and continued trotting alongside her until she left on her own. I could see that she didn't take me seriously at any time, and I don't blame her. That's why I need to get stronger as soon as possible to defeat her and win her heart. Ahem. I mean gain his respect. Yeah. That. At the end of the day I took a bath, and curious fact, since this is a medieval world and in addition to the damn cold that it gets all year round, people don't bathe very often. But I begged my mother to prepare hot water for me every time I finished training and she gladly accepted. I guess I'm that cute, huh? After taking a bath and putting on a change of clothes, I took a bucket and locked myself in what was now my room. Alright, let's start with this, I murmured. I've been increasing my mana reserves these last few years in the hopes that I could perform magic in addition to using the sword. Fortunately, I had taken care of reviewing the spells I learned when reading the novel in my previous life. But even with that, I couldn't guarantee that I would be able to remember them all, so secretly from my parents I wrote down the spells in Spanish so as not to forget them. The problem was translating those spells into this language. Shit. I need to learn to read, I mumbled. I slapped myself in the forehead for not thinking of this before. There was no point in knowing the spells if I couldn't translate them into the local language. I dragged myself out of the room in shame for my stupid mistake. I ran into my mother who was making lunch, and she saw me. Oh, what's wrong, dear? She asked. Mom, can you read? I asked doubtfully. She looked at me confused for a few moments but smiled at me. Yes, in fact only my brother and I know how to read, she said proudly. My face lit up at this and hope returned to me. Could you teach me, mommy? I said while putting on my best cute face. Sure I can, but you won't give up halfway like your father? She said with a smile. I nodded fervently at this with a smile. Yes, Mom. I promise, I declared. She nodded and continued making lunch. Sigh. I guess it will be another time, right? Chapter 5 Disappointment. Another year has passed since I was reincarnated into this world. I am now 3 years old. My sword training should start soon since according to Dad my body is ready after a whole year of training. Obviously I'm tremendously excited about this. Also a few months ago my mother started teaching me to read and write. I think it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But I didn't give up. And so after 7 months of studying I was finally able to learn to read and write the local language. For some this would be a mandatory requirement, but for me it is an achievement that opened the doors to great things in that world. So today on my 3rd birthday went like any other day. I did cardio, took a shower and locked myself in my room with an empty bucket of water. I stood in the middle of the room with the bucket in front of me. My performance in mana growth has also made progress. Now I need 40 minutes to get rid of all my mana. I guess that's an acceptable amount, right? I reached my hand towards the bucket and closed my eyes. Come on Gino, focus, I muttered to myself. Let the great protection of water be on the place thou seekest. I call a refreshing burbling stream here and now, water ball. I murmured with my eyes closed, I immediately felt a warm sensation in my hand, as if you were slowly bringing your hand closer to a campfire. Suddenly a small ball of water the size of a soccer ball formed in front of me. Wah, AAA. I murmured in surprise, causing me to lose control of the spell and it to fall into the bucket of water. I looked at my hand with excitement. I did it, I did it. I murmured excitedly, but then tiredness took over me. What? Seriously? After all this time, that's my limit. I muttered as I fell to the ground unconscious. I woke up who knows how long later in my mother's arms. I looked at her and she was gently stroking my hair and we were sitting on the couch. Hee, have you woken up yet, sleepyhead? She said to me affectionately while hugging me. Shit, I never had this kind of affection in my other life, so I want to enjoy this as much as I can, I thought as I snuggled close to Mom, pressing my face into her modest chest. If you were that sleepy you would have laid down in your own bed, you know? It's not good to sleep on the floor, you'll get sick, Mom said while gently pulling my ear. Yes, I know, sorry, I said apologetically. It's okay, just don't do it again, okay? She replied with a warm smile. I nodded at this with a smile. Mom, what time is it? I asked her. It's about noon, dear, she replied. Half a day, huh? I only cast a water ball and I was knocked out until half a day. I couldn't even cast the spell properly despite spending 3 years increasing my mana. That's disappointing. The rest of the day went by normally. I didn't try to do another spell until I thought of an idea of how to control it. Plus I want to know if I can do the spells silently. At this age it's the best time to do it. The next day went the same way. I woke up, did my morning cardio, took a shower and locked myself back in my room. Now I sat on my bed and put the empty bucket in a corner of the bed. If I fell unconscious again, at least I would fall on the bed and Mom wouldn't be upset. I sat on the corner of the bed, raised my hand and closed my eyes with a deep sigh. Okay, here we go again. I murmured, let the great protection of water be on the place thou seekest. I call a refreshing burbling stream here and now water ball. I felt the warm sensation again and a ball of water formed in my hand. It was the same size as a soccer ball, but now I tried to stay focused on it. Okay, now, how do I throw it? I muttered to myself. Shit. In the novel they never explain how spells are cast. I started to worry and tried to cast the spell cutting off the mana flow in it, but that was a mistake as the spell wore off and he didn't even fall into the bucket. Shit. I muttered as I felt extremely tired again. I fell onto the bed with a thud and was knocked unconscious again. I woke up in my room. The sun was shining in my face through the window, so it was noon again. I got out of bed lazily and looked at my hand. After all this time my mana pool was barely enough for this, and it doesn't seem to have increased at all since yesterday. An intense feeling of disappointment washed over me as I threw myself onto the bed, face up. I stayed in bed doing nothing until Mom called me to dinner. Dad arrived at that time as usual, took a shower, and joined the dinner. Dinners were a nice time for me as my dad would tell Mom how his day was, and she seemed genuinely interested in that. On the other hand, my father told me that it was time to start my sword training, to which I responded with a, yes sir, with genuine emotion. My dad smiled at my conviction and my mom could only sigh in resignation. The night went by normally except for my mother's moans. Really? These guys look like Paul and Zenith in the night. But that couldn't even distract me from the immense sense of disappointment that I feel. With all this in mind, I went to the bathroom to bring the bucket of water back to my room. I stood back on the corner of the bed and reached my hand toward the bucket. Now I would try to do the chant silently. If I could achieve even this much, it would encourage me in ways you can't imagine. Yeah. I sighed deeply as I remembered the quality of the magic sensation. Like Rudeus, imagine the spell in your mind: water, river, sea, waves, water ball. I opened my eyes and in front of me was a ball of water. I did it. I said excitedly, but as I lost concentration the spell broke again and I fell unconscious again. I woke up at about 5 a.m. That was my training time, but I just made a water ball without any enchantment. The mere thought of it made me regain all faith in myself, and I started jumping for joy in my room. Knock, knock, knock. The door was knocked from outside. What's all that noise? It's time for training. My father's voice came from outside. I was stretching. I replied as I put on my workout clothes. This would be the first day I would train with swords. When I left the room, my father was already in the backyard, as always, training with his sword with ease as a sword emperor. His movements moved with infinite grace, and I did not notice even a hint of effort. That was the result of years of training of my father. When he noticed me, he stopped moving with the sword and looked me up and down. Very well, your body now seems ready to begin your sword training, he said as he crouched down to be at my height. Shall I tell you a secret? Generally, children do not begin to train with the sword until they are 5 years old. Your cousin Nina and you are an exception. She is the daughter of the sword god and he has expectations on her, and me. Well, you could say the same thing. You better not disappoint me, you understand? He said while looking me in the eyes. I nodded seriously at this. My father stood up and handed me a wooden sword about 50 centimeters long. It wasn't very heavy. I estimate it weighs about 2 kilos, but even so, if I swing it enough with my current body, it can exhaust me. We will start by practicing your sword swing. You will do this every day for the rest of your life. Even if you become the sword god, you are obliged to do them daily. Understood? He said, and I nodded fervently at this. Very well. Put the sword at the height of your head and let it fall to the height of your waist. He said. I got into position and raised the wooden sword to the height of my head, and when I let it fall to my waist, the sword made a slight noise as the wind blew through. That's something, but get into this position, he said as he repositioned me. He made me separate my legs slightly, straighten my sword, and slightly raised my grip on the sword. Don't forget this position because you will do it for the rest of your life, he said. It's okay, Dad. I replied. How many times do I have to do it? I added. Until you feel like you can't take it anymore, he replied. Okay. I replied and started swinging the sword. 1, 2, 3 swings. It was easy for me. 4, 5, 6 swings. My arms feel uncomfortable. 7, 9. My arms hurt and my breathing is slightly labored. 10, 11, 12. My arms hurt more and I start to lose my breath. 13, 14, 15. I can't take it anymore and I drop the wooden sword while trying to catch my breath. Fucking preschooler body. I cursed in my mind. I looked at my father who was looking at me with his arms crossed. Not bad. Catch your breath and do it again. If you get tired, rest for a while and do it again, he said as he continued with his training. I nodded at this and picked up my sword again. In a total of 1 hour, I did about 75 swings until I couldn't do it anymore. My father congratulated me on my effort and left for the dojo. I was totally exhausted, but I knew this was nothing. I took a bath and continued with my magical training. There is still a very long way to go. Chapter 6 Progress. It's been about 6 months since I started my sword training under my father's tutelage. According to him, I will first train at home until I reach the beginner rank, and then I can start training in the local dojos. My progress in the sword is going surprisingly well. My father told me that before I turn 4 I could reach the beginner rank, which is a great advance for my age. My sword swings have increased over time. I am now able to do 60 swings before getting exhausted, and I recently started jogging using the sword. This is super necessary if I want to learn how to use the sword. I need to find the right balance when running and then attacking. I also increase my resistance to pain by letting my father hit me with a wooden sword, to my mother's dismay. Also, my once soft and plump hands are now covered in calluses and scars from constant training. The sword god style focuses on ending combat with a single blow, which I interpreted as running towards my father as fast as I can and trying to land a blow on him. Something that has obviously been impossible for me. When my sword is close to any part of his body, he simply raises his and blocks me effortlessly. Obviously, I don't let this discourage me because of the obvious age differences, but it still gets tiring not being able to land a single hit. I would have said this before, but one day when my father noticed my frustration, he let me hit him. The result? Yes, I hit him, But Tuki is so strong that the sword literally bounced off his body and I fell on my ass on the ground. Now I just focus on trying to react to their movements, something I won't be able to do in the near future. As for magic, surprisingly I've also made progress. Not as many as I would have imagined, but still something. My current limit is 7 water balls before I run dry. As I recall, 10 water balls consume the same amount of mana as the mid-range spell water cannon. When I reach the limit of 10 water balls, I will try to use the intermediate range spell. I also want to experiment with other beginner level spells but wind, earth and fire, but I can't make them at home, so I'll look for another place. Hiya! I screamed as I lunged at Dad with my wooden sword in hand. I aimed at his legs, but he blocked the blow effortlessly and a push made me fall to the ground. Ouch! I muttered as I rubbed my sore buttocks. I looked at my dad and he had a little smile on his face. What's wrong? I asked curiously. It's nothing, just that from today you can consider yourself a beginner of the sword, my father told me as he lifted me off the ground early. I asked excitedly. Yeah, rest for today and tomorrow I'll sign you up for Donald's dojo, Dad said. Donald is a sword saint in charge of the children's dojo for beginner ranks. And so Dad went to his dojo and I stayed home to take a bath. My mother noticed my smile and came to hug me tightly. Me? Congratulations, darling. But this is the first step, you know? She said while carrying. I know. I want to keep training to be stronger, I said while pretending the enthusiasm of a child. My mother smiled at this and pinched my nose lightly. In the afternoon I dedicated myself to training my magic 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 water balls. I muttered as I fell onto the bed and became unconscious. I woke up in the night with a small smile on my face. Little by little, I muttered as I got out of bed. I had already memorized the house schedules, so it should be dinner time now, and I was right. My parents and I had a dinner like any other, but tomorrow would be the first day of my life to become strong. The next day I got up early as usual, trained with my father for an hour, and then we left for the dojo early for me to sign up. Mom made me a special breakfast to commemorate this day, and I accepted without hesitation. After eating I put on my training clothes and with my little wooden sword I left home for my first day of training. My mother had already taken me to that dojo a couple of years ago when I first met my future wife, my cousin Nina, but this would be the first day that I would go there to train directly. We walked in the cold of the early morning until we reached the dojo. It was barely 6 in the morning and the children's dojo opened at 8, but we arrived early because of my registration. We arrived at the building, which was of considerable size, and in front of it was Donald, the Saint of the Sword, who was sweeping the snow. When he saw my father, the guy stopped what he was doing and looked at us. Mr. Timothy, to what do I owe the pleasure? The guy said as he bowed in respect. I have come to accept my son into your dojo, my father said while giving me a light pat on the sword. I looked at Donald, who was looking at me in surprise. Good morning, sir. My name is Gino Britzes, I said with a bow. Donald was surprised at this and gave me a smile. Very well, little Gino, do you know anything about the sword? He asked me. Yes, I am a beginner in the sword god style, I declared proudly. Oh, you want to give me a demonstration? He said as he unsheathed his sword. I looked at my father and he nodded. All right, Fu, here I come, I declared as I lunged at Donald. Running as fast as I could, I jumped slightly and aimed my sword at his torso. Donald easily blocked the blow, but I could see his movement, although slightly. That gave me enough time to change the trajectory of my attack at the last mementos and direct it at his waist. Although it was a sudden change, Donald was able to block it at the last moment. My sword broke slightly as it hit the sharp side of Donald's sword with a thud. Oh, are you sure you're just a beginner? Donald said as he looked at me in surprise. I looked at my father in confusion and saw that he had a slight expression of astonishment that quickly turned into a smile. What do you mean, sir? I muttered. It won't be long before you're an intermediate swordsman, Donald said as he sheathed his sword. I was in shock at this. Really? Intermission? So soon? I looked at my father and he nodded with a slight smile. After that little duel, I formally enrolled in the dojo and waited for the other students to arrive. To my surprise, the first one to arrive was my future, my cousin. She seemed just as surprised to see me. Little one, what are you doing here? She said to me with a surprised face. What am I doing here? I came to train, I said enthusiastically. Oh, so your weak body has already taken shape, huh? She said with a mocking smile. Yeah, that's why I came to train, I replied solemnly. Nina made a grimace of smile and ruffled my hair. Yes, whatever you say, but if they make us train together, don't think I'll be easy on you, she said with vanity. I just smiled and nodded. So I started practicing my sword swings again just like Nina. Beneath her dress uniform her buttocks were slightly marked, so I allow myself to look at them discreetly until the other kids arrived. Most of the children seemed wary of my presence as the youngest were barely 5 years old. The oldest of all was a 12-year-old boy. Sensei Donald introduced us and the children obviously looked at me with disdain and one or another tried to argue about my age. But Donald ignored it, arguing that he was very talented and things like that, which only increased the children's disdain. Because of this, none of the kids wanted to train with me, and apparently none of them wanted to train with Nina either for some reason. But she didn't seem to care, but I decided to approach her. Do you want to spar? I asked as I pulled out my wooden sword. I won't be gentle for your information, she said as she stood on guard. I wasn't expecting that anyway, I said with a smile while putting myself on guard anyway. To my surprise, it was Nina, the one who attacked first. Lunged at me, jumped slightly and aimed her wooden sword at my neck. I dodged it by just ducking slightly and giving him a direct hit in the rib. Although it was a direct hit, because of this damn baby body the blow didn't have much force. Nina barely winced in pain but quickly recovered and hit me right in the back with a blow that sent me rolling in the ground. Ugh, I muttered in pain as I got up from the ground. I told you I wouldn't go easy on you, she muttered with a smile, but I could see her lightly rubbing his bruised rib. But I hit you first, I said as I stood up. You call that a hit? She said with a mocking smile. So let's do it again, I said with a smile. Sounds perfect to me, she said as she lunged at me again. And so we continued until 3 in the afternoon, which is when the training day at the dojo ended. Our dynamic was that Nina would lunge at me, I would dodge her blow and attack her. My blow didn't have enough force behind it, and she would send me to the ground with a counterattack. And so we were both left covered in bruises, but I could see that we had become closer, somehow. Besides being able to enjoy watching that little ass of hers wiggle, so it was a good day which was full of progress. Chapter 7 Intermediate. Another 6 months have passed and I have now turned 4 years old and Nina have turned 7 years old respectively. After so many months of training together, she quickly reached the intermediate level in the God of the Sword style, which is why she had to change to the secondary dojo. I was still at a beginner level, but according to Donald it wasn't long before I reached intermediate level in the same way. But because of my age and lack of physical strength I still couldn't cross that gap, and my father said the same thing. You are already at the intermediate level but your body does not behave like one, he said. This obviously means that I'm still too young, but I'm still growing, so it's just a matter of time. As for my magic, I have also made considerable progress, so to speak. I can now do 10 water balls before passing out. I had planned to move up to the intermediate range in water, but I preferred to do other beginner level spells in another elements. And for that I asked that I wanted to go out to train in the forest one afternoon. When I left the dojo my mother looked at me curiously, but she let me go. I walked through the village, passing by the dojos that were closed until now, and walked into the forest. Even though it was already summer, the snow never stopped falling in this place. Nina is probably already at home resting. Although we get along, it seems to be a little more of a rivalry than anything else, and the gap only got bigger when she turned intermediate. Now we can't even see each other in training. This really depresses me, believe it or not. I can't help but get depressed if I don't see my future wife. After a while I came to a clear spot in the forest, It was a cliff, and in the background I could see the sea. You don't realize it, but I'm currently in the northernmost part of the world, not counting the sky continent. But I didn't come here to see the sea. I came here to train my magic. I stood in the middle of the snow and closed my eyes, trying to remember the spell. I wanted to make a beginner-level fireball now, and throwing it in the snow would be the best. I focused on a point in the snow and pointed my hand towards it. Let the great protection of fire be on the place thou seekest. I call the bold heat of a torch here and now, firewall, I said, and a ball of fire formed in my hand and shot out to the ground. The snow beneath the spell quickly evaporated, dissipating the spell as well. I did it, I said with joy. Now I'm a beginner in water and fire. Now I plan to do other spells in the same way. And sometime later I used a sonic boom and a stone bullet to become a beginner in the 4 main styles of magic. I had to keep this totally silent. No one could discover me using magic, just for the simple fact that I wouldn't know how to explain where I learned it from. Satisfied with my progress today, I decided to head home, and that's what I did. Plus I was feeling slightly tired, so I went back home to sleep. The next day went by without many problems. I arrived at the dojo and started doing my swings. I can now do a total of 100 swings before collapsing, which is already impressive even for me. Since the kids didn't want to spar with me and Nina was already in another dojo, I couldn't practice with anyone. Donald noticed this and approached me. "Do you want to have a light fight with me?" he said as he unsheathed his sword. I nodded at this and put myself on guard in the same way. The other students formed a circle around us with expectant looks. "Kick his ass, sensei. Go back to kindergarten. Get out." The way I laughed at this, and even more at the kid who yelled "get out," reminded me of a meme in my old world. Putting these thoughts aside, I knew that if Donald made the first move I would have no chance. So I decided to pounce first. I ran as fast as I could, made a big jump and aimed at Donald's neck. I knew he would block the attack, so when I saw him raise his sword to block mine, I quickly changed of direction, quickly propelling me down slightly with wind magic at an imperceptible level. My target now was his shoulder. I could see Donald was a little startled by this, but he blocked the blow anyway. My sword was in my raised right hand. I released the wooden sword and with my left hand I caught it and aimed at Donald's ribs. This caught him off guard, but obviously he could react to this. I guess he had already let me attack it well, so with just a movement of his sword that I couldn't see, I was sent crashing into a wall of the dojo. "Ha! You deserve it, brat. Get him out of the dojo. You don't have what it takes." The children were screaming as I slowly got up from the floor. "Silence!" Donald commanded, and the children fell silent. "You've really impressed me, Gino. Despite your age, those moves took me by surprise," he said as he approached me with a smile. "From today you can call yourself an intermediate in the sword god style," Donald said with a smile. I just looked at him in shock, and a smile appeared on my lips. "Thank you very much, sir," I said enthusiastically. The other children looked like they couldn't believe what they were hearing. "What does that mean? How can that kid be an intermediate? He didn't even have his first birthday." The children screamed in indignation, but neither Donald nor I paid attention to them. And so, that day I became an intermediate in the sword god style. Obviously I ran home to tell her what happened, and she didn't seem to believe me, although I don't blame her. After lunch I continued training in the yard until dinner arrived, and Dad arrived at the same time. "Dad, guess who's an intermediate now?" I said excitedly. Dad, who was about to put a piece of bread in his mouth, looked at me with a raised eyebrow. "Really?" he told me, a bit skeptical. "Of course, Sensei Donald made me an intermediate today." I declared. I could see that my dad and mom were looking at me in amazement, and they both smiled at this news. "I'm proud of you, son. No one has achieved what you achieved at such a young age," he said with a smile. I nodded at this as I looked at him with a genuine smile. Dinner went on as normal, and I went to sleep immediately because of my exhaustion, only to be woken up by my mother's moans. "Really? Damn it," I muttered as I walked to my parents' room. I gave a sharp knock on the door, which made the moans stop instantly. "You're so loud, Mom," I complained and quickly returned to my room. The next day passed normally except that my father and mother avoided looking me in the eyes. Good morning, Gino. Did you sleep well? My mother stammered as she served me breakfast. I raised an eyebrow at this as I looked at her. Mom blushed in embarrassment at this. What did you hear last night? She said while covering her face with her hands in embarrassment. I don't know, everything, I said while eating. Mom didn't answer, but I could see how red her face was. After breakfast, I accompanied my embarrassed father to the secondary dojo. This dojo is supervised by the other sword emperor named Samuel. I will train in your dojo until I become in sword advanced. We arrived at the same time as at the other dojo months ago for me to sign up, and there was Samuel also outside the dojo, but he was just training. Samuel saw us immediately, but he didn't stop training. I looked at my father and he didn't flinch at this either. Good morning, Samuel. I brought my son here as we had already discussed. My father said. Samuel raised an eyebrow as he looked at me. It's already an intermediate so soon? He said skeptically while he looked at me, not to brag, but it seems my son has an innate talent with the sword, Dad said as he patted me on the back. Samuel's gaze went back and forth between me and my dad until he finally stopped swinging his sword. Okay, let's go to the paperwork, he said, and so we entered the dojo. And by paperwork I mean getting my name on an attendance list. The other children started arriving about half an hour later, and to no one's surprise Nina was the first to arrive. Little one, what are you doing here? Nina said as she approached me. I came to train. I recently became in sword intermediate, I said to her as I started swinging my sword. She looked at me skeptically but didn't say anything else and trained with me. The outlook for the intermediates was now very different, as before Nina was the youngest of all the students. And the oldest is a 19-years-old guy. But since I joined, it seems that Nina was released from her status as the smallest, but being the smallest was not something that interested me at all. Nina became an intermediate of the sword 3 months ago, and I can see that he has progressed remarkably in the field. As in my previous dojo, the other students refused to train with me and Nina, so we had no choice but to train the two of us together. I realized something in our training. Nina chooses to be the first to attack in all of our sparring matches, which gives me the opportunity to predict her attack and counterattack. But because of my current body, the strength of my attacks is almost zero, so in the end the one who ends up losing is me. And I think this has boosted Nina's ego in some ways. But I can't complain because I can see her ass jiggling during the sword swings, so I have no right to complain after witnessing something so magnificent. But still, the path to glory is still far away from me. Chapter 8 Failed Flirt. I got a bit freaky here, but don't worry. Let me cook. It's been a year since I became an intermediate in the sword god style, and I feel like I've made considerable progress, but that's about it. I've made progress, but I haven't advanced in rank. But it's not something I'm too worried about, I muttered out loud. What are you talking about? Nina said next to me. Nothing. I just feel like I've progressed in my training, I said in panic. She looked at me with a raised eyebrow and continued training. Since I arrived here, the two of us have been training partners, and our combat capabilities have become equal in a certain sense since Nina won 8 out of 10 fights. However, the fact that she is starting to win fights is something. Since we started training together, I have become closer to her in some way. How do I know? She doesn't call me little one anymore. And that's a big step forward, and she's been nicer to me for a few months now. Our training, however, has been the same as always. But today was different. Today is my 5th birthday, or my first birthday in this world, which is a huge reason for celebration. Hey, Gino, are your parents throwing you a celebration? She said as our swords collided. Yes, do you want to come? You are family after all, I said with a smile. I'll ask Dad, she said in an expectant tone. Our swords clashed louder, marking the end of the conversation, and we resumed training seriously. From the other side of the room, Samuel looked at us both with a smile. Very well, Gino and Nina, you are the 2 students with the best progress in the dojo. I would dare to say that in less than a year you will both rise to the advanced rank. Samuel said with a smile. This statement shocked Nina. She dodged his attack, which made her fall face down on the ground. It's my chance. With the palm of my left hand, I gave her soft buttocks a gentle slap. Ouch! She let out a soft moan of pain as she looked at me reproachfully. Thank heaven he thinks it was with the sword. Samuel just looked at me with a smile. It's good that no one would suspect a 5-year-old child. You mean that, sensei? Nina asked in shock as she looked at Samuel with wide eyes. Indeed, both of them have a natural talent with the sword, he said with a smile. Nina nodded at this, and a beautiful smile formed on her face. Unfortunately for me, this motivated Nina even more, and she attacked me with everything she had. I returned home that afternoon full of bruises. Some fools prefer Eris, but I have enough with Nina, or also with Ghislaine, or also with Roxy. I came home and Mom was making my favorite stew. Wild boar meat with carrots, bread and potatoes. Yeah, Minecraft dinner. Welcome, Gino. Your food will be ready in half an hour. Mom said enthusiastically. Thank you, Mom, I'll take a bath. I said as I took off my training clothes. Sure, your bathroom is ready, she replied. I went into the bathroom and immersed myself in my bathtub. I may have been a misfit in my previous life, but I have always liked bathing. Now that I think about it, Rudeus in his previous life mentioned that he hardly bathed. That guy must have had a tremendous smell. In the main sword god-style dojo, Gulfan was sitting on his throne as he watched the sword saints training in front of him. Gulfaran as always had a bored expression. Since he became the sword god, he submitted to a monotonous life in the dojo. The only ones who can give him a fight are the sword emperors Timothy and Samuel. And it is put in quotes since none of them represent a real challenge for him. His daughter returned from training at the same time as always, but she looked anxious. Gul did not understand the reason for this and put his mind to work. He murmured as he rested his cheek on his fist. He miraculously remembered that today was his nephew's birthday, and according to Nina they had become friends. She probably wants permission to go to the celebration, Gul Faran murmured. To Gulfarian's suspicions, the first thing Nina asked her father was if she could go to Gino's birthday party, which he immediately accepted. Gulfaran has never been too involved in his daughter's life. He leaves that to his wife. At his response, Nina behaved in a very lively manner and put on her ordinary clothes, although she seemed more excited than usual. Gulfaran couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at this as he saw the unusual behavior in his daughter. So she like Gino, huh? He murmured with a grimace of a smile. Gulfaran had no problem with Gino, but he would not give him his daughter's hand if he did not show signs of strength. Sword King, I will only let him marry my daughter if he becomes a Sword King, Gulfaran muttered to himself. My favorite stew was ready quickly. I just took a shower, changed my clothes, and it was ready. Obviously I stuffed myself with food. It wasn't like the food made in my country, but it was something delicious. We had planned to have my celebration the night when Dad returned, and I also told Mom about inviting Nina to the celebration. Maybe Mom noticed my intentions because she gave me a mocking smile. Do you doubt your 5-year-old son's intentions, Mother? As a reason for my birthday, Dad came back earlier than usual from the dojo at approximately 5 p.m. He brought with him what appeared to be a new sword and a cake. But Nina was coming with him. She shifted uncomfortably as he approached me, and now I realize that we have hardly talked except in our training sessions. So even I had no idea what to say. Be okay? Let's do this, Gino. It's up to you to win her heart. Thank you so much for coming, Nina. You look very pretty in that dress, I said while looking at her with a smile. She smiled, but it seemed like it only fed her ego. Shit. Hee. Thanks, little one, she said while messing up my hair. Now? Come sit down, Nina. We're about to serve dinner, Mom said as she served the food. I sat next to Nina and we ate until we were full. I could see that, just like me, Nina is a glutton. The rest of the dinner went on normally. After eating, we shared an improvised cake that my dad he commissioned a student of his who is a baker to make it. He also gave me a regular sword, Obviously it was for when I grew up since I couldn't use it in my current state. My mother also gave me a short sword that would serve me well right now. I had to hold back my laughter at the sight of Dad's jealousy. Nina, on the other hand, looked distressed as she had not brought any gifts. This is my chance. I approached her and whispered in her ear, "Don't worry, I want you to do me a favor later and I'll take it as my birthday present, okay?" I said this made her sigh with relief and she nodded. The night went by normally after a few speeches from my parents about how much they love me and stuff. The celebration ended quickly. My mother cleared away the plates of food, Dad went to sleep, and I asked Nina to help me put my sword away in my room. She innocently agreed and followed me to my room carrying my small sword. I closed the door to my room and I put the big sword near a corner and my small sword I kept in my closet. "So this is your room? Kind of empty, huh?" Nina said with a smile. "Yeah, I don't have many things to highlight here to be honest," I replied. Me and Nina stayed silent and I sat on the corner of the bed and Nina looked at me full. This is my chance. "Hey Nina, could you grant me a request as a birthday present?" I murmured to her. What do you want?" She said while looking at me curiously. Can I touch your breasts?" I said, and at the same time I regretted saying it. Shit, I guess Gull will kill me, huh? I looked at Nina out of the corner of my eye and she was completely blushing but she didn't move from her spot. "I'm not very developed, you know," she said as she removed the straps of her dress. Shit. Will she really do it? Girl before me was revealed the image of a beautiful flat breasts of a completely blushing. "Go on, to do it. But make it clear to you that I'm only doing it because it's your birthday, you understand?" She warned. I nodded fearfully and approached her. I put both hands on her flat breasts and caressed them. This made Nina shudder on the spot as she looked at me completely blushing. Her breathing became labored and she looked at me with tears in her eyes. Take advantage of this and kiss her on the lips. To my surprise, she kissed back and we stayed like that for a few moments. I don't know how long we spent doing that, but there came a point where I was satisfied, so I stopped touching Nina. She was completely blushing and seemed more gentle than usual. I walked her out of the house and she stopped at the entrance. "Hey, are you going to train at the dojo tomorrow?" she said, completely blushing. "Yeah, sure, I'll see you there," I said with a smile. She smiled slightly as she looked at me. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, and she gave me a kiss on the cheek and then ran off into the darkness of the night. Shit, that happened to me today, didn't it? But that's the first step to winning Nina's heart. Chapter 9, Unexpected Encounter. I have no intention of changing the previous chapter. Let me cook. After that weird slip with Nina, I went straight to bed, my heart racing a mile a minute. I really did it, huh? I muttered to myself as I laid back on the bed. I felt both excited and guilty. And now how do you look at Gulfarian's face? I said as I rolled myself up in my sheets. If everything went wrong, I planned to apologize to everyone and run away from the sacred place of the sword, but let's wait and see what happens. As the night progressed, I began to fall asleep. I even forgot about my daily mana drain due to the torment of my actions. As I fell asleep, I felt a strange sensation in my head, maybe guilt or something else. The feeling became uncomfortable enough to ignore, so I opened my eyes and was in a completely white room. There was nothing else, just a white surrounding and a kind of marble floor. "You have to be fucking kidding me," I muttered. I looked at myself and I was back in my 17-year-old body, completely naked. I already knew what this meant, but I never thought he would notice my presence so quickly. Okay, I have to keep up appearances. I looked around and there he was. It was just like his description in the novel. A completely white being with no face except for a creepy smile. Hidegami? Except, this time he wasn't smiling. No, yes, I was smiling, but when our eyes met, that smile disappeared completely. Instead, that smile turned into a grimace, and then he started gritting his teeth in anger. Then that angry expression turned into an expression of surprise and then an expression of fear. His lip trembled and he opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. No. I refuse to believe it. He screamed as he walked away from me. Ah shit, that's right. This guy can read minds. I looked at Hidegami and he looked at me with fear. I don't know, but he was muttering something that I couldn't understand. Hello. I murmured. Hidegami snapped out of his self-induced trance and stared at me. His expression turned angry and he pointed his finger at me. You. How? How do you know all that? He screamed. Know what? I muttered. Don't play dumb with me. You know everything. My existence, what I did and what I plan. How? He shouted as he approached me. Do you want to know the truth, or have you already read my entire mind and are you just in denial? I murmured. He wanted to shout something, but the words stayed in his mouth. He gritted his teeth and clenched his fists in anger. A book? You know everything about me because of a few books. He shouted angrily. Yeah? I guess you already noticed. Right. I murmured. Hidegami continued to look at me angrily, but after a few moments he calmed down and fell to his knees while covering his face with his hands. Go away, just go away. He muttered. Before I could answer, I felt a force that pushed me to the ground, and thus I woke up. I woke up agitated and full of sweat. I looked around and was back in my room. Shit, this is shit. I muttered as I got out of bed. This is worse than I imagined. I hadn't planned on changing world history too much to avoid exactly this. Shit, if I don't do something now, the bastard will send someone to kill me? Yes, he surely will. He knows that I know everything about him. He can't let me exist in this world. Shit, shit, shit. But how? How did he realize? There are 4 years left until the teleportation catastrophe, so what? Yes, that. I muttered as I slapped my face. That slip with Nina probably changed something in the story. I murmured. A change in history means that Hidegami would notice and look for what caused it, and that's me. I muttered to myself as I took off my sweaty clothes. Holy shit, I really screwed up, didn't I? In my misery, I looked out the window and it was my normal time to get up. My head and body were in separate places. I trained with my father as usual, went to my dojo and started training. Only Nina's arrival brought me out of my reverie. Hey Gino, Nina said, blushing as she swung her sword beside me. I didn't even notice when she arrived, but I greeted her anyway. She seemed unusually shy around me and I knew why. Shit, my lust has condemned me now. I guess I deserve it. Is something wrong? She murmured when she saw me in my state. No, nothing, just that you look pretty today, I murmured with a small smile. It didn't cause me anything that she blushed like a tomato while holding my hand. Now I had my head somewhere else for my stupidity. We continued training as usual, but Nina avoided looking me in the eyes. In the end, we gave our usual performance. Despite everything, she continued to kick my ass in the fights, but this time I couldn't land one. Gino? Is something wrong? Samuel asked me, dismayed at my poor performance. Yes, it's just that my dinner made me sick. I muttered to excuse myself. Nina barely contained her laughter and Samuel looked at me in disbelief. Oh, in that case you should do some relaxed training in that case, he said and stopped paying attention to me. I could see that this made Nina laugh a lot, but I didn't give it any importance and we continued training. The day passed without any further incident. Nina's embarrassment was erased by kicking my ass in sparring, so I guess nothing changed. So it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was time to leave, so I stopped training and left the dojo. But between the walk, Nina intercepted me. Gino, she said as she approached me. What's wrong? I said with a smile. She blushed again while avoiding my gaze. Nothing. I just want to tell you that I enjoyed training with you today, she said as she slowly approached me. Yeah, you're my best friend after all, I said with a smile. Best friend? She murmured. Well, in that case I'll see you tomorrow, she said and gave me a kiss on the cheek. I stood watching her as she disappeared into the snow. Shit. I returned home faking my best smile and got into the bathtub. I heard Mom say that lunch would be ready soon, or that it was already. I don't know, I didn't pay attention. Lunch was like any other. I did my best to avoid thoughts of Hidegami while in front of Mom, and I think it worked since she didn't notice anything strange about me. Dad arrived at night and we had dinner with him. He mentioned that Nina had been acting more lively than usual according to Gulfarm. And so the glances turned to me. Oh Gino, at least wait until they both have their second birthday, okay? Mom murmured with concern, and to my surprise Dad agreed too. But wait, what are you two insinuating? That's what I wanted to shout, but I knew I'd be biting my tongue because of my hypocrisy. So I kept my comments to myself and continued eating. Bedtime arrived without further incident. I took a second shower in which I don't know how long it took. Shit, if everything turns out to be shit like I think it is, then I'll have to train more seriously than I've been training. The bastard can simply manipulate Gull or some sword saint and I would be dead in an instant. That bastard Hidegami just has the power to do it, and I'm sure he will. With these thoughts I dragged myself out of the bathroom, got dressed, and dropped face down onto the bed. I let out a frustrated cry into my pillow and rolled up in my blankets trying to sleep. Shit, my mana drain. I muttered as I pulled the sheets off of me. It was now easier to just make 10 water balls and pass out, plus that way I could now sleep with these thoughts of mine tormenting my mind. For that I already had an empty bucket of water in my room, it was a more effective and faster method. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9 and 10 balls of water. I quickly felt tiredness overtake me, and so I fell asleep. I felt the same uncomfortable feeling in my head, and I opened my eyes and I was here again, in the white room. Well, here we go again. I muttered. In front of me was Hidegami, and he looked frustrated. He had his arms crossed, his teeth clenched, and his foot was tapping the ground in a sign of anxiety. So me and this whole world is an invention? He muttered while looking at me. Well, we could call it that, but I'm in that world now and it seems very real to me. I murmured. Yeah, right? He said in a sarcastic tone while stomping his foot on the ground faster. So another reincarnated, Rudeus? He asked, and I froze in my place, but it seems that he is not in this loop. He murmured. Wait, what? He didn't reincarnate? Are you sure about that? I screamed in shock. Yes. Fortunately for me, I have checked on Paul Greyrat and his firstborn was stillborn, fortunately. He murmured as he let out a sigh. I just stared at the ground in total shock. Look, Gino, I came to see you because there was a change in world history and I just wanted to see what it was all about, but now I see all this. He murmured and I listened to him in silence. Listen, your life has no bearing on my future at all, so I'll let you live. He said. Even Orsted without Rudeus won't be able to reach me fortunately, so thank you very much for letting me know everything. He said with a macabre smile that only made me shudder. Thanks to you I know exactly everything I needed. And as a thank you I will let you live however you want. He said with a scary smile as he looked at me. I could only look at him in silence and felt myself starting to tremble. Hidegami started muttering to himself and I felt the same force pushing me back and I woke up again. Chapter 10 Stagnation. It's been a whole year since Hidegami discovered my identity. I'm 6 years old now, and from that day on, I started training harder than I had ever done before. Thanks to this my progress in the sword has skyrocketed. Samuel says I am very close to the advanced rank like magic. I've doubled my mana reserve so I can now throw 20 beginner rank water balls or 2 intermediate rank water cannons. In addition, I am already intermediate in the 4 main branches of magic. The branch that is costing me the most is healing magic, in which I am just a beginner, but it is still a step forward. Besides that, I learned something I never wanted to know. Rudeus was not born in this timeline, so the world apart from me will follow its natural course. But that wasn't good at all. Without Rudeus, Orsted will never be able to defeat Hidegami. Speaking of Hidegami, thank goodness the guy didn't send an apostle to kill me or something like that. With my current strength, it would only take one saint from the dojo and I wouldn't stand a chance. It should be noted that I was paranoid at night for weeks after this, but apparently, that idiot will keep his word. But if that were not enough, he knows that I know everything about him. He knows about Orsted, his curls, and his techniques. I tried to ignore this for a long time but I just couldn't. And to think that just by touching Nina's breast the story would be so altered. What do I mean? Well, since that day Nina has been more affectionate with me. We always walk from the dojo to our respective houses holding hands, and when we say goodbye we always give each other a kiss on the cheek. I also feel like his progress with the sword is stagnant and I feel guilty about that. If I had been told that such an act of lust would harm me so much, I would never have done it in the first place. A week ago was my 6th birthday, and my physical strength is increasing little by little as well as my skills in sword and magic. I got out of bed, put on my workout clothes, and walked out to the backyard. My father was there as always training and I joined him. I started swinging my sword as usual. Smooth and precise movements. If blisters appear, it is because you are doing it wrong and you have to choose a correct posture. Gino, you're doing it wrong again, my father said when he noticed me unfocused. Yeah. It was summer in the sacred land of the sword, and the midday sun warmed my head, causing sweat to come out of my small body. It had been 3 years since I started my training. It had always been rigorous, but it wasn't something I complained about very often. Next to me was my father, who had already finished his own training. He stood with his arms crossed and looked at me with a small smile. For him, he was only supervising my training, but I could see the look of pride on his face. After watching adults train, practice, and duel during these 6 long, sleepy years, I have already given myself an idea of formal combat and what the correct and incorrect stances were. And also there was the situation with Hidegami and Nina. I could ignore the Nina issue since a whole year has passed and nothing has happened, but the Hidegami issue is something I will never be sure about. Even so, while swinging my sword I can easily ignore all that. By doing something as fun, something as simple as swinging a sword, you can avoid any of those negative emotions that in a normal moment would threaten to overwhelm my thoughts. I had the sword tightly gripped, my fingers clenched, my legs spread and resting on the ground, slightly unstable under the uneven weight of my young body. Despite all these years my training all seemed sloppy, but I tried to adopt the best posture I could. I struck again and again, and those wandering thoughts about Hidegami and Nina vanished as all my attention shifted to the small sword in my hand. That simple repetition, holding it above my head, swinging it down, breathing deeply, constantly paying attention to my feet and hands, repeating every movement over and over. I lost count of my hits almost immediately, the world around me unconsciously fading. I entered a state in which I thought deeply about each movement and corrected all the mistakes I saw in each one. If I could make a small change each time I swung and made it a little better, over time something good would form. I would reach a movement that I would be happy with. Thinking about that one moment when I was able to let my thoughts and worries fade away to focus completely on the image in front of me, it didn't feel like a workout at all. It was more like a form of meditation for me. I wouldn't know how to explain it, but it was like that for me. Simply a way to relax and rest the stress in my chest. I continued like this, over and over again, while swinging my sword. That repetitive movement left me blank as I felt what was right and what was wrong in my body. I lost track of the world around me. Time passed at a pace impossible to know. It was easy to do, almost too easy. At this point I felt out of energy, but I felt a strange sensation in my chest, arms, and legs. The tiredness I felt before diminished almost completely. The swings of my sword became faster. I felt full of energy. My head that was spinning before was now back in the world, and my gaze was fixed on my sword. "All right, it's time to go," my father said, snapping me out of my self-induced trance. "Yes," I murmured as I wiped the sweat from my forehead. After my daily training, Nina and I were in the center of the small outdoor training yard, right outside the dojo. It was late and well outside the normal training times of the day, around 5 in the afternoon, and no one more than us he was in that specific patio. We were covered in dirt and bruises, holding the wooden swords with reluctance as we had trained for what must have been over an hour at that point. However, the training was a little strange when it came to the passage of daylight. For some reason, every time I trained with swords, hours would pass before I realized what was happening to me. I still felt I was getting used to the phenomenon. When I mentioned it to my father, he looked at me in total shock. According to him, I am using my tuki unconsciously. If I managed to control that feeling, I would become an advanced swordsman. That feeling started 6 months ago, but I still don't have the slightest idea how to control it. It was frustrating to say the least. What am I doing wrong? I don't understand. I mumbled while looking at the ground. Nina crossed her arms and frowned as she looked at me. Unlike me, Nina, she already had a slight control over her tuki. It was not the best, but it was already something for her age. According to Samuel, if she continued with her training, she would be advanced at the age of 10. Listen, Gino. Just copy my movements exactly, she said. I nodded, and she held her sword in front of her, her sword raised almost directly above her head, before steadying her breathing and closing her eyes for a brief moment. Then she started to move. My future wife rose from the ground with a powerful step forward and cut the air horizontally. The wooden blade cut the air with almost perfect precision and speed, an intensity that broke my hair and made me open my eyes even when I was at a distance. Good distance. She had performed the third basic step. If she applied more strength and speed, she could create and execute a long sword of silence. She would immediately become an advanced in the sword god style. My future wife had accomplished a feat that I still couldn't. With a simple variation of that technique, she had already crossed the intermediate range barrier, which demonstrated her skill and technique superiority compared to me. She still hadn't reached the level of skill needed to execute 2 separate cuts, and she wasn't fast or strong enough to break the sound barrier. She stood up, straightened her spine, and relaxed her posture again, nodding to herself with a smile. I also nodded respectfully. And she blushed slightly. It wasn't an easy technique to use, and although I hadn't mastered it yet, it was very close. Okay, Gino, if you weren't just looking at my ass, you should be fine, she said. I pursed my lips. Without a doubt, I felt a kind of discomfort in my chest. After all, I always found it painful to execute an attack that I knew was too difficult for me, not because it hurt physically, but simply because it was clear that I had ruined the perfection that other more skilled swordsmen could achieve. It was silly to worry about this, but he couldn't help it. Gino, you're thinking too much again, she said with exasperation. I shook my head and took a step forward. I know, Nina, but no ifs or buts. You have to feel it, you know. Just feel the sensation, like that time you touched my breasts, she said, blushing. What kind of example is that, huh? Although his words were not clear, she said them with frustration, waving his arms frantically in the air to convey the emotion. I smiled at him, appreciating the advice for what it was, even if it didn't exactly help. Thank you, Nina, I said with a smile, and she blushed and looked away from mine. I put myself in the same position that Nina had been in. I opened and closed my eyes after visualizing the movements with perfect clarity, and I released the oppression I felt in my chest. Pressing my front foot deeply into the ground, I jumped forward. Swinging the sword downwards, I focused all my attention on remaining firm and calm in the face of the terrible pressure that would soon follow. Of course, it was not as planned, and more. I failed. Chapter 11. It is still very early. I walked home with Nina that same day, shortly after the failed technique. We were both depressed because even she could feel the disappointment of my enormous failure. A tremor of hesitation filled my body as my small house came into view, our steps crunching in the snow, slowing and hesitating. I felt midline horizontal ellipsis strangely uncomfortable at the thought of seeing my parents so soon. Although they both loved talking to me about my training and progress, there was a hesitation in our interactions. No. There were expectations, expectations after seeing my extremely rapid progress in my training. When we reached the front yard of my house, Nina looked at me hesitantly. "Okay, see you tomorrow," I said with a small smile. She smiled at this, approached me and gave me a long kiss on the cheek. "I'll see you later," she said with a blush on her cheeks as she walked in the snow. "I tried the third step transition today," I muttered. My parents looked at each other expectantly and then looked at me. It was incredible, it was a lot of fun, but although I could definitely feel that my actions were complete, but do you know the feeling you get when you execute a technique successfully? Well, it didn't work. I murmured as I stuffed a piece of bread into my mouth. My father nodded and spoke immediately after, sensing that it was time to give a lesson on fencing. Of course, self-confidence is absolutely necessary to succeed, but confidence alone is not the only requirement for power. If it were, every ignorant fool who traveled here to challenge the master would be a much bigger problem. My father said while playing with his pork rib. "Well, I know that, but..." I shook my head. I had been practicing it for a while and I felt like I did it perfectly. The sword just slipped out of my hands. I murmured as I leaned back in my chair. "Gino, you're not stupid, we all know that," Dad said firmly. I had a feeling this wouldn't turn out well for me, but I nodded in confirmation anyway. "So, if you're not a fool, why have you been practicing transitioning, as if you could succeed so easily?" Dad said sternly. I blinked and Mom took advantage of that moment to intervene between us while she looked askance at Dad. "I think what your father is trying to say here, Gino, is that you're not ready to try techniques at that level yet," my mother said with an apologetic expression. This time I couldn't stop a grimace from forming on my face imitating my father's. "But I've been training for 3 whole years and I feel like I'm improving. But my results are still the same." I protested. "I must be doing something wrong if the sword keeps slipping away from me." I protested in frustration. "Gino, how old are you?" my father asked while looking into my eyes. "What does that matter?" It doesn't matter how old he is as long as he's skilled enough. You too have said it before." I shouted furiously. "Don't raise your voice anymore, Gino," my father said almost as a growl, and I gulped hesitantly, shrinking slightly in my chair before nodding. "I will not allow so much shouting under this roof. It is true that we have supported you because of your age and you have shown great potential with the sword, but now you have a different problem that will it will come up again in the future," my father said firmly while my mother looked at me with concern. "What's going on then?" I muttered. "The sword slipped from your hands, didn't it? If I assume that your technique was perfect, as you claim, there can only be one reason for such an action," he said seriously, something I was already used to. I stared at him. After all, my father is the second strongest swordsman in the world, only below Gulfarn. His advice is like a gold mine. "You are still physically weak, it is simply a sign of your age, and it is noticeable even when we train in the morning," he said, and I nodded slowly. "So, how can I overcome this problem?" I muttered, but I already knew the answer. I just wanted to see if my father could give me a shortcut. "It should be clear, the only way is to wait. You are 6 years old and you have already surpassed the intermediate rank. You have practiced your techniques well, but skill means nothing if the right strength," he said as he resumed his meal. Of course, there was no other method. But then my father smiled. "I rarely see him do it, but most of them are directed towards me. Don't worry, Gino, very soon you will be powerful, we can all feel it," he said. My mother laughed, and the tense air seemed to disappear from the table. Even my frown of discomfort disappeared. The meal was almost finished. I smiled at this, nodding along with the rest of the conversation between my parents. At that time, when my father had spoken so confidently, declaring that I would obviously be powerful as soon as I finished growing up. I love using the sword. There was something charming about swinging it outdoors and practicing with it, getting better every day. When I felt like I was stagnating in the last few months, I felt uncomfortable. I have always thought about becoming powerful. Since I was born here, since I became Gino Britzes, that has been my main goal. But I guess even with that in mind, I can still expect to grow up, right? No? There is the threat of Hidegami. I will not rest easy until I at least become the sword god. But after a year, if I relax. Sigh. Shit, all in due time, right? The next few days went by as usual. I trained from the moment I came out on my own until I went to bed, always with Nina by my side. Seeing my determination, Nina herself began to train harder, and after 3 long months without any progress, Nina executed her first sword of silence and thus became an advanced rank swordswoman at the age of 9. Because of that, she moved to my father's dojo and I stayed in Samuel's dojo. Even though I was alone again here. When we left our respective dojos, she always came to accompany me to train. On my magic side, it's progressing little by little. What do I mean? Now I can throw 21 water balls before I passed out. And how many water balls could I throw before passing out? Well, 20. Yep, a big change. 1, 3, 4, 5 swings. My current limit is 500 swings. Yes, believe it or not. But still my strength just doesn't increase. I asked Nina and she agreed with my father. I'm just too weak physically. Another 3 months passed. Now we are close to winter. I recently asked my parents to let me wander around the city once every 10 days to rest. My father only agreed when I promised to swing day and night. Today I decided to visit the Adventurers Guild, if the reason is the Adventurers Guild of any generic Isekai. But this time I had the intention of becoming an adventurer, and although I just wanted to see how this place works, to register I brought with me some copper coins that I asked my mother for. According to my father, in addition to strength, I need real combat experience. Obviously, my mother told me this so that she would listen to us, otherwise she would have killed us both. Iobook. For this occasion I carried the sword that my father gave me. It was a little big for my age, so I carried it on my back. I arrived at the Adventurers Guild and the laughter and conversations ended when I entered the place. I received stories of looks of disdain and superiority that reminded me of my previous life, which made me shudder with discomfort. Trying to avoid the stares, I reached the counter of the Adventurers Guild and there was a human girl with big breasts and a smile. Her hair was brown, her eyes were black and her hair was tied back in a braid. According to Rudeus, there always have to be women like that in this type of jobs for some reason. Welcome to the Adventurers Guild. How may I serve you? The woman said. I want to register as an adventurer, I said to the woman. Okay, write down your information here, she said as she handed me a tablet. Thank goodness I can now read and write. I wrote down my personal details and the woman shortly after gave me an adventurer's badge. Name, Genobritz's rank, F race, human age, 6 sword god style, intermediate water magic, intermediate fire magic, intermediate wind magic, intermediate earth magic, intermediate healing magic, beginner. I checked my adventurer tablet which contained my personal information and skills. I should keep this thing hidden from my parents. I had no intention of looking for an S-rank job, even I knew my limits. I would currently focus on some F-rank or E-rank job. It wouldn't be too dangerous, but I might kill some monsters along the way. I went to the application board and started looking through the jobs. One of the many caught my attention. I need help to move magic items from the Uega cave to my warehouse in the northern area of the sacred land of the sword. Requested by Baka. Reward, 10 copper coins per person. An F-rank job, the best to start with. Plus I heard from Nina that the Uega cave is slightly dangerous. I noticed that there were 2 other papers with the same notice and there were also 2 empty spaces between them. It seems that 2 adventurers have already taken this job, huh? I muttered. But it doesn't matter. In fact, I don't even know why I'm doing this. I just want to get out of my routine and that's all. I took the application and brought it to the girl at the counter. She signed me up and so I was able to go on my first mission to gain experience in this world. Chapter 12 First Blood. I started walking through the forest towards the Uega cave. The cave was on the outskirts of the sacred land of the sword, about a 15-minute walk in total. It wasn't a very dangerous place, but sometimes you could find some monsters to kill and things like that, plus it was in the middle of the forest, which created a huge concentration of mana on the spot. The guild receptionist gave me a kind of token before leaving the guild so that whoever submitted the application could identify me. As I mentioned before, the place is not very far away and it will serve as an experience for life, and also if the opportunity arises I will be able to kill a couple of monsters. In the main dojo, the Sword Saints noticed Gul Faran frowning on his throne as he read a letter. He had also adopted an uncomfortable posture while reading the letter and sometimes looked to the sides so that no one could see the content of the letter. "So that bastard dares to come back, huh?" Gul Faran muttered as he put the letter away in his coat. "If he dare to set foot in this dojo, I will kill him immediately," he said as he stood up from his throne and went into his room. No one knew the contents of the letter and Gul Faran had no intention of ever revealing it. Gino POV. I walked for about 20 minutes through the forest until I reached the cave. The place was not very attractive or threatening, it was simply a cave and the only one nearby, so it was not difficult to find it. When I approached the cave I took out my identification card and I checked the surroundings. "Hello. I came for the job of loading magic tools," I announced from the exit of the cave. There was no response, so I decided to go in. The place was lit by torches so I wouldn't get lost. I walked for about 2 minutes until I saw some magical objects lying out of a box. "What the fuck?" I muttered as I gathered the items. "B-boy, what are you doing here?" I heard a voice murmur from the darkness. I instinctively looked at the place where the voice came from and I remained on alert. "Who is it?" "I came for a job from the Adventurers Guild," I muttered while accumulating mana in my hand. "And my name is Baka? Help me please," the man begged. I approached the voice and with fire magic I illuminated the place. The guy was lying in a corner of the cave. He was covered in blood. He was missing a leg and an arm. I quickly approached the man and chanted an intermediate level healing spell that only sutured his wounds. Who did this to you?" I asked as I helped him sit on the floor. "A swordsman. He attacked me treacherously, me and the 2 children with which I was carrying my magical items." Baka murmured weakly. "2 other children? Are they dead?" I asked. "He killed the girl and took the boy deep into the cave." He said, "Did you see how powerful he was?" I said, He was wearing a black fur coat, so I assume he's at least a sword saint." Baka muttered. "Shit, this is bad. Let me help you out of here." I muttered as I tried to lift Baka up. "Wise, please," he said as he leaned on me. I tried to lift Baka with all my strength, but I was only a 6-year-old boy and he was an adult. Even though he was missing body parts, the guy was still heavy. We started walking towards the outskirts of the cave, with the guy using me as a walking stick. "Thanks, boy." Baka tried to say something but fell to the ground with a thud. "Hey, are you okay?" I tried to check on Baka but was horrified when I saw that he had a dagger embedded in the back of his head. "He's dead." Instinctively I looked back but I couldn't see anyone. I unsheathed my sword and heard the whistling of a dagger towards me. "Shit!" I screamed and narrowly dodged the dagger that crashed into the floor. "Who are you? Show yourself!" I shouted while tightly gripping my sword. If this guy was a saint then I was dead. I tried to make a tactical retreat but a huge earth wall rose behind me blocking the exit. "A magician swordsman?" I muttered. "Nah, it's just a magic circle." A very deep male voice sounded from the darkness. And from the darkness a huge man of about 30 years old emerged, with a thick beard, blonde hair, and a large diagonal scar which covered almost his entire face. He was wearing a black fur coat, and at his waist he had 2 swords and a pair of daggers, a practitioner of the North God style, and apparently a very skilled one. I didn't expect a couple of brats and that jerk to be here, but what does it matter? He said as he unsheathed his sword. "Who the hell are you?" I muttered as I got into a combat stance. The man grimaced as he looked at me. "Of course, nobody knows who I am, right? While that bastard Gull spends his days lazing around the dojo, I'm here, fighting to survive," the man shouted. I stood silently looking at the man. Bah, but what does it matter? My name is NASCAR and today you will die, kid, he said as he got into a combat stance. Why are you doing this? I murmured. Hee, you're very young little one. But I'll just say that I'm about to settle accounts with my old friend Gull. He murmured. A moment later his image faded from view. I instinctively crouched down and a sword brushed past my head. Not bad. He muttered and with a quick kick he sent me flying into a cave wall. As soon as I regained my senses, the guy lunged at me. I didn't have enough time to dodge and his sword cut off part of my left arm. Ag! I shouted as I walked away. You are very good at this, kid. I'll guess, intermediate? He muttered as he wiped my blood off the sword. I remained silent as I looked at my wound. A deep cut? I'll need at least intermediate level healing for this. You've got talent, kid, what a shame you're going to take on me. He screamed and his image disappeared from sight. Instinctively I created a dome of earth around me and crouched down. The dome was split in half like butter. So you have magic circles too, huh? He said as he looked at me like a predator at its prey. Shut up. I yelled as I walked away from the place with a sonic boom that made him back off. Shit. I only have mana left for about 5 spells. My swordsmanship it is not comparable to his. I'm going to die. Magic without incantation, huh? Isn't that curious? He said with a smile as he got into a relaxed position. He lowered his sword and put a hand behind his head scratching it. It was obvious this guy didn't see me as a threat. Shit, I only have enough mana for 5 beginner spells or 2 intermediate spells. Gino thinks, what should I do? Let's bet on that. I concentrated mana in my hand and with combined magic I created a thick mist between the two of us. Gah, you're a clever rat, huh? He murmured. I took advantage of this opportunity and jumped at his legs. As expected, the guy blocked the attack and kicked me into the air. What should I do now? I know. I threw a stone bullet at him at the highest speed I could muster. Nonsense. He sneered and split the stone bullet in half. I started to form another stone bullet, now bigger, while the guy looked at me. Try whatever you want, you won't beat me. The guy shouted with disdain, all right, fire. I threw a huge stone bullet at his head. That won't work on me, anim, aya. NASCAR split the stone bullet in 2, but unlike the others this stone bullet contains small pieces of stone in it, how the strategy Rudeus used against Aubert. The pieces of rock were embedded in the face of NASCAR at high speed. His face and eyes were crushed by stone fragments, by shrapnel. Damn it. Damn it. He screamed as he fell to his knees, holding his head with one hand and swinging his sword in all directions with the other. I dodged the attacks and with a quick movement I sliced his arm. Yag, fucking brat. He screamed with a final, accurate movement. He cut off his head and his body fell lifeless. Shit. I muttered as I fell to my knees from exhaustion. I couldn't process what I had done because of the adrenaline, but I had killed for the first time. Chapter 13 Advanced. I was out of breath as I was kneeling on the floor, blood running down my left arm with a huge wound on it. Next to me was the corpse of a guy named NASCAR who attacked me without any explanation, and also, he is the first person I have killed in this world. Shit, I don't have enough mana for a high-level healing spell. I started looking into the NASCAR corpse to see if there was anything useful. Luckily for me, the guy had a series of magic circles. Yes, just what I need. I murmured happily. I had found an intermediate level healing magic circle and an equally intermediate level detoxification magic circle. I used both just in case, and the wound on my arm and the bruises healed, although there were scars left. I'll have to cover my arm in that case. I'm not good at making excuses. Ugh, now what do I do with all this? I muttered as I looked at NASCAR and Baka's corpses. I continued to examine NASCAR's corpse, and in addition to the magic circles I found daggers, poison with antidotes, and a letter. I took the letter and put it in my jacket along with the daggers. On second thought, I must report this. But also, I need to find these kids' bodies anyway. I took the NASCAR swords and started walking into the cave. I spent about 10 minutes searching until I found the corpse of a little girl. At least 10 years old. She had a huge cut on her abdomen and was leaning against the wall. I guess this is where Baka was ambushed, huh? There was a considerable amount of magical objects around, some broken, some scattered, and others in boxes. Check the girl's adventurer card to find out her identity. Name, Katrina. Age, 9 years. Occupation, beginner level water mage rank. It was all shit. The poor girl was perhaps adventurous in order to live, and now she's dead. What a shame. I walked for another 3 minutes and found the corpse of a boy of about 11 years old. The poor thing was decapitated, but nothing more. It took me about 30 minutes to gather all the bodies at the entrance. With a stone bullet, I broke the stone wall that NASCAR created, although with that I was almost out of mana. I left the cave and went to the Adventurers Guild to report the news. Some adventurers were sent to confirm the situation and they let me go. It was around 11 a.m., so I didn't have much to do. My first job as an adventurer almost resulted in my death, and my almost non-existent experience with the sword was of no use. Nina, on the other hand, must be at the dojo right now, and she will still be out for a while, so I'm bored, plus I don't feel like going home. I walked through the forest until I reached my favorite cliff. There I decided to train. What went wrong there? My inexperience? My fear? Was it a sudden attack? I've been training with sword and magic for years. I thought I was better with the sword, but I won the fight using magic. But it was a stroke of luck. The guy was extremely confident and I was almost out of mana. If that guy didn't destroy the stone bullet, if he just dodged it? No. Thinking about that only makes me feel bad, like with Hidegami or with Nina. So I decided to go training in the forest to kill time and relax my mind. Sword swings have become a common thing for me. It's no longer a workout but a way to relax, plus my swing limit is now about 200, so I've noticed a lot of progress in that area. After a few moments, fatigue invaded me, sweat ran down my forehead, and my grip on my sword weakened. After all, almost all of my mana had been spent in my fight with NASCAR. But then I felt it, the feeling. My grip on the sword became firm, my vision cleared, my breathing regulated, and my energy increased. This is my Tuki. I closed my eyes, concentrating on the feeling. 4 months now my Tuki has been activated unconsciously, but I simply cannot control it, which frustrates me too much. Oh, feel the sensation? I muttered to myself, it's like mana or a variation of it. I breathed in and out deeply as I focused on manipulating my Tuki. I tried to manipulate him into my arms. I tried to manipulate him into my legs. I tried to manipulate him into my sword. Nothing worked. It was just frustrating. I stopped swinging as I caught my breath and looked around. A snowy cliff with pine trees and some rocks. To the north you can see the sea in which you cannot swim. It was a good view if you will remove my mental disaster. Sure, he's still ignoring the fact that you killed a person, right? I don't feel bad for the guy, he deserved that and more. But it's more complicated than that. I understand Mark Grayson and other people with dilemmas when it comes to killing. It's not like I enjoyed it or anything, but the feeling of taking a life is not so easily forgotten. But it was good in a way. As long as I still felt bad about killing, then I'll know I'm not bad. Have you ever felt sorry when you killed an ant? I don't want to be overcome by such desensitization. But what does it matter? Now that I have caught my breath, I started swinging again. I had no plans to stop, not until I was the strongest swordsman in the world. I wouldn't stop, I won't. After half an hour, fatigue returned to me and I dropped my sword to the ground from exhaustion. Phew, what a day! I muttered as I sat on the floor from exhaustion. It was around 3 in the afternoon. Nina must have already left her training, but I'm not in the mood to see her right now. In fact, I'm not in the mood to see anyone right now. I was planning to continue training the rest of the day, but apparently your mana doesn't regenerate until you sleep, and I was already significantly tired. What can I do now? I muttered as I looked around. I scratched my belly at the uncomfortable feeling of my wet shirt, and then I remembered it. The NASCAR letter. I muttered as I pulled the paper envelope out of my jacket. I was planning to read it when I was already home in the privacy of the night, but curiosity is killing me. I got up heavily from the ground and walked to sit under a tree, took the envelope, opened it, and looked at the contents. You realize that, right? You thought I would let you keep the main dojo without a fight, huh? You're such an idiot, Gull. You know that I am the legitimate god of the sword, you know that, and yet you took away my title so many years ago, my title, my prestige, and my wife. What more do you want from me, moron? I know you've discarded my previous letter, but I want you to know that you're no longer safe in your dojo. When you least expect it, I'll attack you while you're sleeping and feast on that daughter of yours. NASCAR. At that moment, all uncomfortable feeling of killing vanished. I now regretted not giving that bastard a more painful death. Seriously, messing with my future father-in-law is one thing, it will be years before I even put up a fight. But my future wife, that is unforgivable. It's a good thing I killed that bastard. That disgusting man deserves nothing but death. Wow, these are some things in life. I muttered as I got up from the ground. I shook the snow off my body and walked over to grab my real sword and my wooden sword. Crack, streak, thump. I looked towards the forest as a sound of branches breaking sounded. I drew my sword just in case and, oh shit. I muttered as I watched the creature emerge from the woods. A mountain black bear, a C-rank beast. The bear just noticed me and lunged at me. Shit, if I use magic I'll be unconscious. I tried to get out of the bear's path. I could barely do it by centimeters, but with a simple headbutt from the bear, I fell on my ass on the ground. I quickly unsheathed my sword, but the bear was faster. I dodged one of its claws and attacked it, but the bear was simply too fast. I was barely able to make a small wound on his left paw, and the bear charged me. I fell on my back and felt a pair of claws rip into my back. Yeag! A cry of pain came from deep within my throat. The wound left by the bear was enough for him to grab me by the back with his mouth and start shaking me on the ground. F. No! F. I screamed in pain. The bear kept scratching my back, and I felt like I was touching a bone because of the intense pain. In a desperate move, I played dead. The pain was so much that I could barely stand still, and I was so tired that I couldn't scream. The bear started sniffing me all over while I stayed as still as I could. I felt one of its paws on my back, which almost made me scream in pain. The bear stood on top of me. I felt the bear's murderous intentions fade away, and he was now sniffing me. The fucking bear put his paw on my head while smelling my face. The pain was so much that I bit my tongue to keep from screaming. Blood started coming out of my nose and ears, but eventually the bear left me alone. And there I stayed. But no. The damn bear started pulling my foot. The fucker wants to eat me. In a distraction, I tried to get up with all the strength I had left. Blood was running from my sword and a huge red stain was imprinted in the snow. I used my own sword to get up and got into an attack stance. My sword broke under my weight, so I quickly switched to the NASCAR when the bear noticed that I was still alive and lunged at me. I closed my eyes. It was this or I would die. I focused on my Tuki. Please go to my sword. Even when I felt my consciousness fading away, I still held on to my place with sheer force of will. My right foot planted firmly in the snow. I stepped forward, and with a huge leap I lunged at the bear. I did basic position number 3, but I didn't stop there. The whistling of my sword disappeared when the blade sliced the bear's neck. That was my first long sword of silence, and that day I became an advanced swordsman. Chapter 14. It's worthless. Everything was confusing. At one point I was about to go home. I was about to leave. I already had my swords collected, but I heard a noise in the forest. A black bear attacked me brutally, and then with a movement that I did not understand I killed it. It wasn't me. It was like I was reacting on instinct. When I came to my senses, the bear was dead and headless, and I was lying on the ground bleeding to death. Shit. I can't even fight a bear. How can I fight Hidegami? I muttered as my vision blurred. Gino, where are you? I heard the voice of a girl I already knew. It was a girl. Shit. She probably came to train with me? No Janu. Nina screamed in desperation and I could feel her running towards me. He skidded in the snow and I could see his look of horror as tears welled up in his eyes. She looked around and I could see that she understood what happened in an instant. Oh Millis, Gino. Hold on. I'll get help. Screamed as she ran away. Will she arrive on time? What does it matter? This life was good while it lasted. Oh, forget it, I guess I'm alive, right? I woke up in a bed obviously, I was apparently at home. I felt a lot of bandages around me. Shit, healing magic is really necessary, huh? If I continue like this, I'll be bedridden for months. I felt terribly weak and also my back. The pain in my back made me start writhe in pain again. Shit. Gino. Nina's voice echoed in my ears and I was surprised to see Nina in my room. She ran to me and hugged me tightly. I couldn't scream in pain because I felt so weak, but I did arch in response. Sniff. Sniff. I was so worried. She sobbed while hugging me. I'm fine now. I murmured. Nina looked at me with her eyes wide open and kissed me on the lips. It was a kiss that lasted about 10 seconds, but she cried again after that. Gino. Mom's voice was heard from the entrance of the door. Nina darling, let him go, he's hurt really bad. Mama said worriedly as she pulled Nina away from me. I could see tears pouring from Nina's eyes as she looked at me with concern. Honey, how are you feeling? Mom said with concern while looking at me with equal concern. Like shit. I muttered. Nina smiled at this and Mom frowned. Sigh, just this once I'll allow it, she said with a weak smile. In short, I lived by pure luck. My back was completely destroyed, I have a skull fracture and hundreds of broken bones. But other than that I'm fine. You're a lucky brat, you know that? Gul Farayon said with a smirk from beside. Oh yeah. I forgot to mention it. While I don't know who along with Nina took me back home, my father found the letter and the NASCAR sword. You don't have to be very clever to know what happened. And the guild receptionist gave the information I gave about a crazy swordsman who killed a merchant and 2 innocent children. With all this, in a single day my parents found out that I killed a saint-rank swordsman and hours later a bear. I could see a proud smile from my father and a grateful one from Gul. I still have to thank you, Gino. Even though I could have killed him effortlessly, it's good to know that there's someone there besides me to protect my daughter, he said with a smile. I nodded at this and looked at Nina. Of course, I would do anything for her. I murmured and Nina blushed. Wow, slow down speedster, Gul said with a warm smile, something I had never seen on him. The incident ended there and I stayed in bed for 2 weeks until Dad brought an advanced level wizard and healed my body. The next day I was back in my training and I did it. I was training the next morning with my dad after being healed. Thank goodness my skills had not decreased. In fact, I felt stronger. I stopped swinging and started walking in front of my father. He looked at me strangely. What are you doing? He asked me. I didn't answer and got into a combat stance. My father also got into position while looking at me with a raised eyebrow. Come on, Gino, you can do it. I put one foot on the ground and launched myself at my father with a huge leap. Now, with a diagonal movement of the sword, the whistle as it cut through the air and a shock sling came out of the sword. Obviously he was going all out. I knew my father would deflect it effortlessly. And so he did, although I could see his eyes wide open. Effortlessly my father deflected my sword and knocked me to the ground with a sharp thud. It was the long sword of silence. My father muttered as he looked at me in shock. Ouch. Yeah, I used it for the first time when I killed that bear. I muttered while rubbing my butt. I think well done. My father said as he patted my head. That day I officially became an advanced swordman of the sword god style. 1 year have passed since that day. I am now 7 years old. Winter in the sacred land of the sword is always harsh. Our fine cloth garments, typical of the eastern monasteries in my old world, did not protect us from the climate. The kids my age would gather in the smaller dojos in larger training groups, but I had already surpassed them all by that time. I had already reached the advanced rank, and my father had granted me the privilege of training in the central dojo, something that not even Nina could do yet. I was allowed to spend time in the building where I could observing the teachers and other adults who gathered under the tutelage of Gul Farn. All the swordsmen in this building were at least sword saint rank. I couldn't train with them. I'm too small, too weak, even after growing for many years. Obviously, I spent most of my free time in this central dojo. Every day I woke up just as the night sky began to show a glimmer of light. With snow on the ground all year round, I ran, honing my body at my father's command. Nina accompanies me sometimes before going to training. Sometimes I slow down my pace so I can see her ass when she runs. She has noticed this many times but has not complained about it, which is good. The girl is already showing her strength and worth. According to Gul, we both have enormous potential, and obviously he has a preference for his daughter, and I don't blame him. And as things are, I had only one friend, a 10-year-old girl and my future wife. And although she was brilliant for her age and was already a brilliant swordswoman, it could be a little depressing to realize this. But after exhausting myself in training, after those hours of cutting the sword in the palm of my hand and meditating with it in my hand, after all that, it was time to observe the experts in the central dojo. Many people came and went from that central dojo, but the masters who studied in this land all year round every year, in other words, the sword saints and the two emperors of the sword, my father and Samuel, they all met here every day. Life has been good this year, but on this winter day, inside the central dojo where I sat with my legs folded under me, leaning against the wall, things began to change. Two saints bowed to each other in the center of the room. Others sat beside me and around me, against the walls. The room is large, with a polished wooden floor, so it is comfortable to walk barefoot. On the back wall was Gulfar. He looked thud. He was leaning back with his head resting on the palm of his hand, almost as if he was about to fall asleep. Although he is the pinnacle of what I train, he could be childish in his manners. He is the kind of person who is able to take whatever he wants whenever he wants. He doesn't respect anyone. He doesn't need to respect anyone. Before the two saints could begin their duel, the doors of the central dojo opened, bringing a blast of cold winter air into the hall. A stranger walked through the door with his chin held high, a weathered man in his 20s, his baggy travel clothes stained with mud, a patchy beard reaching down to his jaw, and a thin, twisted mouth, which formed a mocking smile. His eyes, as I could see from my seat on the floor, were like those of a pig. They are sunken into the skull. They are small and black, full of contempt. He wasn't really very memorable, just a traveler. I would come to meet many men like him in my life, and I have already killed one of them personally. This is supposed to be the place where the sword god sits on his, but The man asked and there was no answer. But I did notice that Gulfaran narrowed his eyes from where he was lying. Other than that, he didn't move. I had the feeling that I was about to see someone die. I'm here to become a sword saint. Do you hear me? The man shouted. What is the process, old man? He kept shouting from where I was sitting. The other students around me were talking to each other. Is the teacher going to kill him? How come he's not dead yet? I was wondering the same thing obviously, but I had no one to whisper to. My Nina wasn't here yet. Then the man turned his disdainful gaze towards the crowd watching him. All these kids here, is this supposed to be a daycare? I didn't come here to visit an imposter, did I? The man said disdainfully. It's been a few years since I've seen one of these guys in person outside of NASCAR, but they'd occasionally pass by arrogant swashbucklers who hadn't seen enough of the world how to understand what they were talking about, so conceited that when they heard about a man called the Sword God, they had to come up and spit on his boots. Sometimes these swordsmen got into trouble, attacking students living in the dojos, challenging people to duels on the street, and more. I had seen some of them annihilated in front of me by experienced warriors with less patience. Despite being physically still a child, I had seen people die and had already killed. The sacred land of the sword, for its beauty, was a brutal place. Life or death duels, fought with real swords, were not uncommon, and my experiences seeing bloodlust told me that this arrogant stranger was about to die. Chapter 15 Dissonance. Gulfaran sat up and his voice echoed in the hallway. So, you think you're strong, huh? He wasn't even looking at the challenger. Her eyes had locked on him for a moment before dismissing him completely. Instead, he was idly looking at the silent spectators, the sword saints. And then the sword god looked through the crowd, at me. And I'd like to see what you're made of, sword god. The man chuckled, obviously amused by the title. But Gull was not interested in the teasing. He continued to stare at me, even as I spoke again. Okay, then I'll let you prove yourself, to see if you're all you're worth. Defeat a swordsman and I'll let you challenge me to be a sword saint. A bloody smile formed on Gull's face. Gino, come up here, you will be his opponent, he said with a smile. The students around me turned around and all stared at me with wide eyes. I'm sure I looked the same. I blinked several times before I could process the words clearly. I stood up, the stranger turned to look at me and anger appeared on his face. You want me to fight with a boy? Do you think I'm a joke? Huh, he said with anger. Yes I do, Gull responded with a sadistic smile. Yes, I think you're a joke, Gull continued. The people in front of me on the floor moved until I could walk forward, a clear path through the crowd. I moved toward the center of the room, the smooth wooden floor beneath me, glistening in the light of the flashlights. On the roof. They gave me a sword. It was made of simple steel, without ornaments, a sword without a name, without identity. My hand held the sword firmly as my life depended on it. Steel lives to death. Let's see you, stupid bastard, if you manage to survive this little boy, Gull said in a solemn tone. So it was just me and the swordsman. He had already taken out his own sword. It was a simple long sword, more worn than the one they had given me, with fine scratches crisscrossing the hilt. It seemed sharp, used, and in the hands of an experienced man. The guy's face was clouded, red with anger. I heard a couple of laughs that reached my ears. The sword saints that surrounded us were laughing among themselves. I tried to ignore the murmurs around me as best I could. It was just me, the steel blade in my hand, and my target. Something echoed in my head and I realized it was blood, rushing through my ears, a dull roar. My heart was pounding. I heard it so clearly. I blocked everything out. I blocked out all the noise. The handle of my spade was cold, very cold in my hands. The sensation of the handle, tight under my fingers, heavy and cold. The man shouted. He shouted at Gulfaran. His face was red with anger. His figure was sloppy. His legs were too bent over each other. His sword too high. Then it moved. He was not a weak swordsman. He recognized it from his first action. His form corrected automatically, just before his attack. It happened in an instant, almost too fast for me to catch it, but his knees fell to the ground, his sword came forward and he lunged at me in a single thrust. It wasn't exactly a long sword of silence, as an advanced practitioner might do, but I was sure it was coming. That's how fast the sword came towards me. I saw it almost in slow motion. The wind split in two and the steel blade headed straight for my neck. In 9 out of 10 battles between two sword god-style students, the one who attacks first wins. However, I had good eyesight. I could dodge well. I took a step forward and let my weight fall. His sword flew over my head as I moved into his space. Just below his arms, I heard a whistle of wind that cut just above me. I barely moved my sword. At that moment, all I did was take a step, put one foot forward and walk through him. I pierced his chest. It didn't take any force for the point of my sword to pierce his skin and slide between his ribs. My sword came down in a single slash, straight down from where I had stabbed his body. In retrospect, it was a very simple attack, a slash, first up and then down, executed immediately after having compromised his guard. A fountain of blood cascaded onto the polished wood below us. I stepped to the side and let the man's body fall to the ground. My sword was soaked in blood. I took a deep breath. My eyes roamed over his body. I don't think I'll ever forget the look on his face for a while. Those pig-like eyes, sunken and small, full of arrogance, the wisps of beard along his jaw. His mouth was thin and crooked, his face was pale, lying there on the floor of the central dojo. He seemed surprised. Let out a deep sigh. I noticed that the crowd of sword saints were still sitting around us. They were applauding. The guy's corpse was carried out of the place by some sword saints and others were left cleaning up his pool of blood. And the imbecile twisted while he was dying, which is why he stained the floor of the dojo. I was congratulated by Gulfaran for this, and in the evening he returns home as if nothing had happened. And in this place it's kill or be killed. That guy wasn't the first one I killed and I don't think he'll be the last. When I got home my mother was as usual making a stew. My father would still take some time to arrive, so I decided to go to my room. My mana reserves have increased this year. I am now able to cast 40 beginner level spells or 4 intermediate level spells or 2 advanced level spells. I say this because each level consumes different amounts of mana. Likewise, my skill with the long sword of silence has become better. I can boast about this, and I have also used my adventurer card well. I'm now a C-rank adventurer. It may not be much, but I only go out on missions once every 10 days on a whim. And thanks to my work as an adventurer I have managed to save a few coins. It is already a considerable sum, but I have nothing to spend it on. My life has been easy so far. My father was right. I feel like I've stagnated again in my training, but at the same time I feel like I'm getting stronger every day. My next step is to make a long sword of light. Still, the difference between a long sword of silence and one of light is like night and day. Some might think it's just about swinging a sword faster, but the most experienced can reach the speed of light with the tip of their sword. Even though it sounds impossible to believe, I refrained from thinking about it, knowing that the great forest reigns for 4 months without interruption or even the existence of magic. This is just a different world, my new world. It's been a month since the incident with that wandering swordsman. Now I'm back to my training at the dojo. Gulfaran watches us closely as we train, but since the day I killed NASCAR, Gul seems to have taken a liking to me, or so I think. Sometimes I'm the only person he sees train, and he gives me advice on what I'm doing wrong. Even training here is proof of that. Of course my father brought me here, but he is not in charge. If Gulfaran had wanted, I would have been kicked out of the dojo until I became a sword saint. I guess I've already proven my worth, right? Gino. Huh. I let out a little scream as I looked at the person calling me. In these moments of sword swinging is when I focus solely on it. I disconnect from the world, in short. In front of me was Nina, with a wooden sword and a uniform that reminded me of the karate outfits from my old world. Wait, what is Nina doing here? What are you doing here? I asked, confused. What am I doing here? I came to train. She declared. Wait, you're already a sword saint? I said in panic. Of course not, but I will be soon, she said, crossing her arms. So, I muttered, waiting for an answer. My father allowed me to train here after I begged him, she declared proudly. Some saints looked in our direction and then at Gul so that he would avoid looking at us. Hey, so Gul also has that side, huh? Well then, try to keep up with me, will you? I said with a mocking smile. I could see Nina's eyelid twitch at this, and she frowned and lunged at me. I can only say that we put on a good show, and it was declared a draw due to fatigue. Gino Britz's age, 7 sword god style. Advanced water magic, advanced fire magic, intermediate wind magic, intermediate earth magic, intermediate healing magic, advanced detox magic, intermediate chapter 16 focused. When the sun finally touched the horizon after a day in the sacred land of the sword, I often collapsed to the ground. It was a final point, something that told me that night had arrived and it was time to rest. During my training, doing fencing movements and visualizing a world laid out before me, I always lost track of time. Just like the first day of my sword training when I was 2 years old, it was difficult to pay attention to the pain. The sword rose above my head, staying there for a moment while I corrected my posture. Then fell into a forward cut. The tip of the wooden training sword would stop just above the forest floor. The winter snow began to melt slightly, although here there was never a day without snow. In the spring and summer its density decreased significantly. Although the spring buds had not yet appeared, the sky was bright and the sun beat down on me through the frozen branches of the trees. I hadn't realized it was coming, because I was still absorbed in myself while swinging the sword, but Nina was there leaning against one of the trees. She was silent, with her eyes fixed on me. Another year has passed. I am 8 and Nina is 11. She had her blue hair up in a ponytail and it reached her shoulders. I could notice a light blush on her cheeks as she looked at me. "Hello, Nina," I said, and she seemed a little scared but kept looking at me. "How are you, Gino?" she asked while playing with the end of his hair. "I'm fine," I replied. She furrowed her eyebrows slightly at this response. "Wait, this is not my general training place. After that bear attack all those years ago I decided not to return there anymore, and now I am in the southern part of the sacred land of the sword. How did you find me here? Were you following me?" I said in confusion. At this, she crossed her arms but she was blushing deeply. I followed your footsteps. And besides, I want to train with you," she said as she tangled up her words a little. I nodded at this with a smile. Even so, I noticed that my body hurt a lot. I was breathing with difficulty and my chest was rising and falling. Despite the interruption, I appreciated the break. I must have gone at an intense pace to play because of how exhausted I am. "Sure, would you like to train?" I replied with a smile and she nodded. I saw that she also held a training sword beside her. The wooden blade was carved from strong oak. Most of the children in the sacred land of the sword had many of these. These swords were made specifically for our infamous bodies. "These swords are made for our childish bodies." Nina walked to the other side of the clearing, holding the hilt of her sword in both hands, looking at me seriously. We had sparred with training swords countless times over the years and I won 4 out of 10 times. Nina, like me, is a child prodigy, or so the adults say. We are both advanced in our sword style before our 2nd birthday. Both of us on our way to becoming sword saints, most likely, a rank that most swordsmen only aspired to throughout their lives. I could still remember her when she was barely 3 years old. When I was a baby, my mother would hold me in her arms and sometimes I would watch her while she trained. The difference back then was like night and day, his stance focused and his grip on his sword is firm. My own training sword was light in my hands, much lighter than real swords. I raised a hand in front of my face, feeling each finger move. The calluses on my hand had darkened to a deep brown, despite the pale skin blisters were beginning to form, which was not a good sign. It meant that I was probably gripping the sword wrong. The muscles in my wrists were also tense and sore. My whole body hurt too, but it's not that serious. "Are you ready, Gino?" she said, and I nodded. The weight filled my palms and I breathed deeply. My shoulders dropped, and with them fell all the tension left in my muscles. The wooden sword was so light, much lighter than steel. All I had to do was stop thinking and learn to act without worries. How did I kill that man in the first place? How did I defeat him? A man at least 20 years older than me, with much more experience than me? The answer was short. He had distractions on his mind. That's why. That simple reason. These distractions stole his attention so he couldn't concentrate on the goal in front of him. He couldn't even see me. Of course I could dodge his sword. It was the same as if I had fought a blind man. So the solution is to concentrate. But it is one thing to say, concentration is the only answer. Concentration is mastery of the sword. And quite another to actually do it. How do you calm your mind in the face of so many distractions? Take a deep breath, put them aside, look at one thing, the only thing in front of you, and just take it in. Everything else will come to you if you have faith, as Narrato says. "Okay, I'm ready and I'm not going to hold back, you know," Nina said with a smile. I looked ahead. She was in the same position, with her training sword extended in front of her. Those clear eyes without fear. Ready, I replied. I saw the light. Nina's sword filled my vision. She used a simple technique and cut me from above. My legs tensed and I stepped forward. My sword flew up and the two blades collided with each other. I took a step forward, letting my body continue to move, using the momentum of my load. His sword fell to the side, grazing my shoulder, but now it was completely in its space. I hit her full in the chest. She threw herself aside, rolled in the snow and raised a cloud of snow. I fell silent. The snow fell back to the ground and the air cleared. I saw her standing in front of me, 24 steps away. My grip had become strong. I was clenching the hilt of my sword with white knuckles. I exhaled a sigh, slowly, my heart beating hard. And in that instant I charged at her again, my sword raised and pointed at her side, but when the distance between us disappeared, I saw that her own sword was about to reach her throat. She was faster than me, of course she was. However, the wooden sword in my hands had the perfect weight. I felt each of my fingers on my hilt. Each one of them registered the smooth surface. Every electrical signal in my body activated. With just a slight shift in pressure, my sword collided with hers. We lean against each other, pushing each other with our whole bodies, with our shoulders tense and our arms stretched out. The two wooden swords were at a stalemate. We were crashing at low altitude. The cross members were almost touching. My fingers trembled on the sword once more. A touch of weight on the bottom of the grip, a slight tug on my index finger. I let all the pressure, all the fury with which I clenched the sword, fade away. I kept the hilt loose. The impulse drives me more than anything else. I slammed my foot hard against the forest floor. His sword fell beneath mine and the clash opened. I saw a window, and a perfect window, where his body was exposed. I swung my training sword and she ducked. I felt a blow to the side of my head. Everything disappeared. Yes. That was much better, Gino. I knew you would improve. Nina said enthusiastically. I moaned in pain as I lay on the ground. The sky had become darker, much darker than when we had started. My whole body was burning, but I was smiling. It wasn't a toothy smile, but my lips were curling up and I couldn't help it. Nina appeared above my head. She was smiling too. That was the best thing I've ever seen you do. Honestly, you almost won me over in the end. Seriously, you did it. She said enthusiastically. Thanks, Nina. I muttered tiredly. I raised a hand and she grabbed it tightly. I grunted with the effort as she helped me up. I grabbed a member to lean on her, with my arm around his shoulders as I caught my breath. What do you think? She asked me as we stood there in silence. Are you feeling better? She said with a smile. Yes, I think so, I answered her. She chuckled. I knew it. Sparring always cheers you up, but you get too obsessed with your feelings, you know? What a funny guy, she said with a smile and then kissed me on the cheek. I elbowed her at that comment, but that only made her laugh. Faster, my father said. My father and I were in the yard. I was holding a real sword, not a wooden training sword, and was using it to attack my father. None of my attacks reached him. Be more decisive, he said again, deflecting my sword. I growled in irritation, let out the air I had in my lungs and straightened my posture by taking a step back. I lunged at him, looking him up and down, trying to find an opportunity to attack. But I knew that no matter how I approached, he was fast enough to defend himself. Every one of your movements must be done with the intention of ending the fight, he said in a monotone voice. His gaze was hard on me. I understand. Let a deep breath fill my chest. For the sword god style, every attack could become the final blow. The steel blade in his hand arched in the freezing air. My father blocked the blow. I took another step without backing up, using the momentum to move again. My sword moved, going up and down to his feet. Our blades collided with each other and threw off a shower of sparks. Each of my attacks was received as if I was hitting a brick wall. I didn't stop. I slowed down. Every time I threw a blow, every time my sword went to his body, I moved faster. I moved with more confidence in my own body. I was getting better. Chapter 17 Cold Summer. An image formed in my mind, growing a little clearer each time I swung the sword at my father. It was the image of every blood cell and muscle fiber laid out in perfect detail. As I moved, I felt them all vibrate in unison. I stepped forward, slashing, but was deflected. I stepped to the side, slashing again, but was blocked. My body collapsed, my weight disappearing as I fell to the ground, and I swung my sword, trying to cut his legs from below. My father found my sword easily, as if he was reading my mind. I slid the steel over his blade, the grinding of metal echoing in the courtyard, and I let all my strength go into my legs, pushing him towards him. My sword came very close but disappeared and only cut through the air. I breathed heavily being alone, and my father looked at me. "Okay, Gino, that's enough for now," my father said with a smile, and I immediately fell to the ground from exhaustion. My knees hit the snow and I couldn't help but collapse completely. At this point I was having trouble breathing. The muscles in my entire body were so starved for air that I couldn't breathe enough or fast enough. My father knew how to push me to the limit. We had only been training in the yard for 10 minutes this morning, but I was already completely exhausted. "Get up, Gino," my father said. His voice reached me, and somehow my body obeyed, my muscles burning, and I was surprised to find that I still had enough strength to stand. My vision blurred and blood rushed to my head, but I kept my eyes locked on him. "Maybe we need to work on your stamina, but that's a task for another day," he said. I could only nod. I didn't have enough energy to respond with words. "Your overall ability has increased a lot, along with the strength of your body. It's clear that your duel with that outsider was good for your growth," my father said as he looked at me as if he were evaluating me. I looked down from his gaze. The snow on the ground had turned into mud and slush. I inhaled and exhaled, my heart still pounding. "I think it would be fair to call you a sword saint." "Yes. You just need to make a long sword of light and you'll be a full-fledged saint," my father said. "Really?" When I looked at him, I saw nothing but pride. "Thank you, father," I replied with a smile. I bowed to him. It was more to hide my expression than anything else. The smile on my face was embarrassingly large. I had managed to wipe the sweat off my face, but my cheeks were hot. At this, my father chuckled, a real smile, and turned around. "I recommend you run for more than an hour a day," he said as he walked back to the house. The tone of his voice was unfamiliar to me. I don't think he had ever said, "I recommend you," to me before. It was always an order. "But you should talk to Nina about your Tuki. That will be the secret to becoming stronger from now on," he added. "Oh, Gino! Holy rank, how amazing!" My mother clapped due to her obvious youth. She was a woman in her early 20s with marked features but always cheerful in front of me. My father in comparison simply nodded. He was much older than her. "Yes, he has shown powerful growth in the past few years," he said. "Powerful growth is an understatement, Tim. When was the last time you saw a child of his age reach that rank?" "Not even little Nina has achieved it," my mother snapped. At this my father gave him a look and turned to look at me. I had been silent, simply eating the roast meat my mother had cooked, from an animal native to this world. "Yes, but the fact that you are young and skilled does not mean that you should be carried away by ego," my father said simply. He looked at me with narrowed eyes, as if it was a problem when I lived in the same house as him. Every time I saw my father brandish his sword, I was reminded of the abyss that still separated us. "Don't worry, father, I would never do that. I have you as an example to follow," I replied. He allowed himself to smile and leaned back in his chair. Although he has never been very expressive, I had managed to learn a little about him over the years. At least I know that he likes compliments. In these last few years, as I grew older, I managed to master a special technique, the long sword of silence. The air crackled behind the tip of my sword. Nina teased me for a whole week, and then I finally understood, saying that I had never smiled so much in my life. She was probably right. Every morning, as the sun rose, I would go out for a run alone for hours. I had drawn a small circuit around the sacred land of the sword and also the big city, and I saw daily some familiar people and faces. Merchants setting up their stalls, shop owners sweeping the doors of their shops, several people already heading to the market. In the end, I would return home where my father would be waiting for me, supervising me for a short time before I left to teach at his dojo and to the central dojo. He is an emperor of the sword, a master of his art. I had considered him for years a man worthy of praise, and he still was. Not like Paul, the guy was nice but he was shit at the same time. Feeling the wooden sword in my hands, I raised it over my head before swinging it down. My practice swings had gotten faster over the past few months. My father must have thought the same as he nodded to himself out of the corner of his eye. "Don't let your thoughts stray," he said. I growled in response to confirm, before taking a deep breath, pushing all distractions aside. I inhaled, let it out, inhaled again, and swung the training sword. I wondered what his name was, the name of the man I killed in the dojo. I stopped swinging the sword, the wooden blade falling to my waist as I let out a sigh. "What's wrong, Gino?" my father asked. He crossed his arms. I had only started practicing swings a few minutes ago. "Sorry, I'm a little distracted today," I replied. "It's okay, it's normal to have bad days, but it's a bad habit to stop training even on those days," Dad replied, and I bowed my head in agreement. "I know," he looked me in the eyes at this. "What's distracting you?" he said. I hesitated before speaking as it was a stupid thought. "Do you remember the man I dueled a year ago?" I asked. My father narrowed his eyes as he looked at me. "Yes," he replied dryly. "Did we know his name? Who was he?" I muttered. My father raised an eyebrow at this. "Why would that be important?" he asked. "I think about him a lot, about that duel, about how I killed him." I muttered. "Well, you shouldn't worry, he wasn't important in the grand scheme of things. In your life, you will end up with many men stronger than him, and you shouldn't let any of them overwhelm you. You are a swordsman, Gino," my father said in a monotone voice. "He's right, it's obvious. I already knew that this world is like this. You kill or you die, it's that simple. I knew what was waiting for me since I came to this world when I became Gino Britzes. And if I wanted to be the strongest of all, then I must not let a guy like that overwhelm my thoughts. But still, thanks, Dad, I said with a bow. "It's okay, keep training," he said as he took his sword, and so the two of us continued training. The air was warm on my skin. I don't think it's about my body anymore. I thought out loud. I think it's more a matter of mindset, or also some kind of mental energy or something like that. I muttered. Nina was in front of me. "But doesn't it get stronger the more you train your body?" she asked with a frown as she looked at the wooden sword in her hand. "Yes, but that's just the first step," I said with a smile. It had been about 2 months since my father named me a sword saint. I couldn't make the long sword of light yet, but I was within the physical capabilities of one. Nina, on the other hand, seemed to be at some kind of bottleneck. Since she became an advanced swordsman, her progress hadn't been much, which has caused a gap in strength between us in just a few months. The 3-year gap had finally closed. "Are you ready to start over?" I asked her with a half smile. We had been training all day in an area of the forest which I had self-proclaimed as mine. She nodded, knowing as well as I did that talking about them would do no good. "Ready?" I asked. "Yes," she replied, and immediately a flurry of snow fell to the ground, and then she was in front of me. Her wooden sword came towards my head but was blocked. My sword rose and she pushed it back with a crack that echoed in the clearing. She moved from another direction, stepping forward with the momentum she had gained in an instant, attacking twice more in quick succession. Again I blocked both. I did so without moving anything but my sword, my eyes following her, despite her best attempts to break the line of sight. The air shifted again. Once again, the sword came for me. This time I allowed myself to take a step back and she only cut through the air. I saw the compression in her eyes. She had overstepped. There was only an inch, but I took advantage of the opening. It was as if my body jumped with electricity, energy rapidly rising from my toes, crackling in my blood. I lunged forward, following her. She jumped, desperate to escape the reach of my sword. My legs buckled and the light in the world around us dimmed. The air between Nina and I suddenly shattered. I was on top of her, My long sword of silence was about to crash into her skull. I saw the moment it registered, the moment she jammed her sword between her and my sword. My poor Nina went rolling through the snow. She soon stood up, but from her frown I could see that I had beaten her up. I walked over to her. I looked at Nina and she sat on the ground with a groan of pain. A sigh left my chest and I sat beside her breathless. She frowned as she looked at me. Her clothes were wet from rolling around in the snow. "Damn it. I almost had you," she protested. I just laughed at this. It felt good. Chapter 18 Sword Saint Part 1. The sun had set behind the mountains on the horizon long before I headed home, my eyes fixed on the night sky above me, the countless stars that shone down upon the world. That beautiful sight was a nice distraction, a good way to focus on something other than the pain racking my body, the countless bruises crisscrossing my skin, and the tiredness that had set in. A full day of training, from before sunrise to after sunset, was nothing to joke about. I always dreaded that grueling walk back home. A mile or two of snow-covered hills separated my training spot from the village, where I had nothing to do but stumble home and think about the day. On what I could have done better in duels, aspects of my technique I could improve. There was always plenty to work on, and plenty of mistakes to identify. Nina had left shortly after our last sparring, hours earlier, limping away and muttering a "see you later," and nothing more, disappearing into the hills, but I didn't worry. She always got upset when I didn't get the win. I knew she wouldn't take it personally. She's really strong. None of her friends from the dojo could even land a hit on her. Maybe that's why she got so bitter after losing to me, I muttered to myself. I dismissed that idea. It was a waste of time to think about things like that, things that had no relation to what was important. It took me almost an hour to finally get home. When I opened the door, my eyes were already half closed and a yawn was on my lips, but when I saw my father at the kitchen table, I stood at attention. "Hi, Gino," he said in a low voice, so probably Mom is already sleeping in the other room. "Hi, Dad," I said, nodding my head. He gestured for me to sit down. I did so quickly and put my training sword against the wall, next to the front door. There was a lit candle on the table between us, almost melted down to a stump. It must have been sitting there for a while. His eyes were fixed on me, but I knew I wasn't in trouble. I'd never done anything to make him nervous on purpose. I mean, I didn't do much more than train, and I doubted he'd find that a problem. He was the same and probably worse than me in that. "I see you haven't used your new sword very often," he said seriously. My eyes went to the other sword that was leaning against the wall, along with the training sword I had just dropped. It was NASCAR's sword. Since my other sword had broken, I had taken over his sword. The sword was sheathed in fine leather, and a hint of steel shone in the dim candlelight between us. "I've been training a lot with Nina, and we use wooden swords," I muttered. My father gave a long, low hum. His expression didn't change. It was all angles and shadows. "I agree with you. You two aren't skilled enough to avoid injury while training. However, you should always have a real weapon with you, in case of emergency. Have you forgotten what happened with the black bear?" my father said. I let him continue talking. I appreciated the advice, especially from a teacher like him, but I was tired after the day. "And real swords have a very different weight than training swords. You should know that it's better to use them for practicing strikes and while training alone," he said. I nodded. "By the way, how have you progressed?" he asked. "Nina and I have been training hard," I said slowly, "and I am able to use the long sword of silence steadily. Now we have been focusing on our tuki," I continued. "Yes, I see," he replied dryly. My father stood up from his seat and the scars on his face furrowed in the candlelight. "Come with me outside. Bring your sword, the real one," he said seriously. I followed him. It was late summer, that time of year, and the sacred land of the sword was on its warmest days, which meant that instead of there being many meters of snow on the ground, there was only a thin layer of it. Under the stars, my father and I stood facing each other in the training yard in the backyard of the house, my pain still not fading from the day of training, but I had the feeling that he wouldn't mind me using it as an excuse. I couldn't make out his expression, even in the starlight. He unsheathed a long sword. It wasn't his personal sword, the magical artifact gifted to him by the sword god, but a simple, well-crafted weapon, but it was still alarming to see it in his hands. My father could probably make a butter knife look menacing if he held it, and this was definitely not a butter knife. I swallowed hard and unsheathed my own sword. There was something different here. Our usual training sessions were in the morning, under the light of the rising sun. They were almost informal. My father gave me opportunities, let me make suppositions and improve my technique on my own. I cleared my thoughts when I saw him prepare his sword. Defend yourself, his voice reached my ears. My grip tightened, I moved my sword in the air, placing it in front of me, pointing at him. A simple guard, he was a dozen steps away, could he react? A gust of wind and a flash of light. I felt the cold prick of steel on my throat. My father's sword rested on my neck, his eyes locked on me, standing above my shoulders. My voice came out, we'll try again. Next time try to answer, my father said as he looked at me coldly. He walked back to his starting position on the other side of the courtyard. I realized I was shaking. I don't think he'd ever shown me his speed before. Sure, I'd seen him watching from the sidelines as he and the sword god fought with friendly intentions, but that sword had never come for me, never seriously. It was a different experience, standing in front of him as he stared me down. I think I made a small mistake in your training, Gino. You have a brilliant talent, we all know that, but I think, because of that talent, I've pampered you, you've been allowed to go off on your own into the city, to the Adventurers Guild, off the beaten path. There haven't been many occasions where you've been truly tested, my father said firmly. His eyes were shining like two flints. I didn't answer as he continued speaking. You only had to prove yourself once to that stranger, a few years ago. Do you remember the duel? In the central dojo? My father said. I nodded, my movements jerky. Hans Regen, the name stuck in my mind. Then you should remember how much you improved in the following months, Dad said. The hilt of my sword was especially cold in my palms. Surprisingly, my trembling had ceased. My master, the god of the sword, and I agree that the best swordsmen are born under the greatest pressure. There is no powerful warrior who has not faced difficulties. He continued. The reason why that night seemed different to me was clear. In front of me, my father did not see me as a son, but as an enemy. A cold sensation invaded my mind, an icy coldness, like steel, that cooled any other emotion. A coldness identical to the calm I had felt years before when I faced Hans. My father was imitating him. He wanted to get that terrible and bloody intention out of me, and he was succeeding. I'll count down from 3, then I'll cut your right shoulder. It'll be deep, Dad said. Slowly, very slowly, he raised his sword even higher, to a point in front of him. It was a common offensive stance, the high guard, used as the starting stance to unleash the long sword of light, the most powerful and famous technique of all. Would he use that attack against his son? 3. My legs buckled beneath me, my sword dropped to my waist, the tip barely hovering above the ground, the low guard stance, used to receive an attack from the high guard. If I did it right, I could cut him off at the wrist with its first strike. 2. I took a deep breath and let the air fill my body and run to the tips of my fingers and toes, blood running through my arms and legs. I felt it, energy, electricity, crackles and accelerations. 1. I let all the air fade away. The faint starlight, shining on the snow of the training yard, dimmed until it was gone. I felt it, the world on my skin, pressing against me. The light exploded silently. My arms raised the sword before I could form a thought. Everything was so still, remembering it now, what felt like an explosion, a burst of energy and air that could have destroyed me. It was all in my mind, the wind whipping my ears, the fire burning in my veins, all of me, suddenly, alive. My skin throbbed, the stars overhead, the candles still flickering in the house, the air. In my hair, the sword in my hands, the light. I felt everything more than seeing or thinking. I simply stopped breathing. And then it was over. Blood splattered and a jet of it glistened in the air, my blood. I gasped as the pain hit me, burning in the tendon of my shoulder. I lost control of the sword, stars in my eyes as my knees hit the ground. I moaned, choking back the scream, tears flooding my vision. I saw my father's boots crunching in the snow in front of me. A hand appeared in my field of vision. I grabbed it, shaking, helping myself to my feet. I saw a smile on his face. My eyes, still blurry from the tears I had held back, fell on his hand, where he was holding me. I was staggering, the pain still taking over my head, messing with my thoughts. I would have fallen to the ground if he hadn't held me. But at that moment I didn't care. I saw something else that caught my attention. A small cut on the corner of his wrist, where he was holding me gently. A trickle of blood dripped from the razor-thin wound. It was no more than the width of a fingernail, but it was there, in my father's hand. I looked at the ground next to us, where my sword lay in the fallen snow, a single drop of blood staining the steel edge. Between the tears and the pain I couldn't help but laugh. Chapter 19 Sword Saint Part 2 The wound extended from the corner of my collarbone to the center of my chest, blood seeping out the edges, dripping onto my clothes and arm. "Hold him, calm down right here," my father's deep voice said. That sound alone was able to draw my attention to him, away from all the sensations that were drowning me at that moment. He stood in front of me, with bandages on his hands, while holding my arm. We had many supplies in the house, which we had needed for a long time for the wounds caused by training. However, it was the first time I had been cut so deeply, it would probably leave a scar. He didn't show much remorse for potentially maiming his son, but he at least intended to clean it up. I tried to focus on my tuki, that warm and light energy inside me. It wrapped around my limbs, and electricity ran through my blood even after the fight was over. I wasn't sure what had changed, but I could feel it, like water in my body. It filled every scale of skin and raised hair. It was an instinctive realization. I had reached the next level of understanding. "Hey Gino, listen to me boy," my father said, snapping his fingers in front of my face. At this, I blinked and looked at him. "What's wrong?" I muttered. "Raise your arm slowly," he said. I raised my right arm. A stab of pain made me shudder, but I continued. At shoulder level, I stopped when another wave of pain invaded me. "Can you go higher?" he asked. "I don't think so, not without hurting something else," I replied. "Wait there," he replied. It took him minutes to finish bandaging the wound, covering that part of my chest and shoulder with the bandages, poking and prodding with wet tweezers, brought from somewhere in the house. The stars seemed dimmer than minutes before, and the candle in the window on the kitchen table had gone out. The summer night wind gave me goosebumps under my thin sportswear. I breathed deeply, the heat inside my body, that crackling electricity, my tuki, it writhed non-stop throughout my body. Even though everything was dark in the night, I could see the pores of my father's hands, the shine of the snow on the ground. That was all my tuki meant, a sensation, a deeper understanding of my own body. It was like magic. At that moment I felt I felt weak, but my father didn't seem worried. He bandaged the wound, dried it, and pressed it with a cloth. He had his own wound, that little red cut on the corner of his wrist. It couldn't have been bigger than a paper cut, but it made me smile. This man I call my father is an emperor of the sword. The only person stronger than him, in our art, is his teacher, the god of the sword. I had managed to touch that man. To a certain extent, I had validated my existence in this world. That was what I felt that night, as the stars shone above our heads. He bandaged the wound in silence. "Dad," I murmured. "Yes?" he replies. "Do you think we could try again after you've finished bandaging me?" I murmured. A puff of air, visible in the cold night, came out of his mouth. "Unfortunately, no, you won't be able to wield a sword with that wound. We're not users of the northern god. We can't waste time without the proper technique," my father explained. I frowned, the pain in my shoulder intensifying under the thin layer of bandages. Did I understand what I was feeling, the energy flowing under my skin? How long do you think it will be at least until I'm completely healed? I asked. A few days or 2 at least, maybe just 1 or 2 now that you can use your tuki, he replied. 2 or 3 weeks, to do nothing but sit and wait for it to get better. If only I could use my healing magic, but it would only cause more questions than answers. What kind of ridiculous punishment is this? My father smiled at the expression on my face. Maybe we can find a magician to heal you, but don't get your hopes up too much, he said. I nodded firmly. I wasn't going to wait 10 or 20 days for it to get better. I ended up waiting 10 days to get better. The Holy Land of the Sword is a gathering place for all the best users of the God of the Sword style in the world, a place where swordsmen could come to advance their art, surrounded by other pioneers and dedicated students. Magic users didn't tend to stay in one place for long. Even in the Adventurers Guild, the warm tavern in the center of town that had several job offers posted on the wall was filled only with swordsmen, not a single mage to be seen. There was no church in town of any of the religions that are so popular in this world. It turns out that swordsmen are a rather atheistic bunch, including myself, and without a church, there were no priests with healing magic. In the Holy Land of the Sword, no one could use healing magic. At first I was confused. How did bloodthirsty swordsmen deal with training wounds? That question ate at me throughout the week I stayed home, under my mother's watchful eye. I guess, in the end, all those swordsmen took care of their wounds. It was that simple. However, I couldn't take care of my wound even though I could. That would only trigger a lot of questions that I'm too lazy to answer. Nina came to visit me and laughed at the expression on my face when I looked at her. She came each and every one of those days, just to bother me. I didn't need to do training exercises in my backyard, right where I could see. I don't need anyone to remind me that I couldn't do it. That anger only lasted for a day, before I realized that this was the best training I was ever going to get. After that, I watched her closely, every flaw in her technique, everything she excelled at, the spasms of her muscles, the snap of her sword as it cut through the air. She seemed slower than usual during those days. As I sat watching from the side, I could easily follow the tip of her sword. It had been a long time since I had focused on watching another person train, probably not since I was about 2 years old and still wasn't allowed to practice at all. I had spent those first 2 years just as helpless. Carried everywhere by my mother, only able to watch, never putting in any effort. I was too weak back then, and now with the bleeding gash carved into my upper chest, I was just as weak, just as helpless. All those days I did nothing but laze around. Nines trained in my backyard. My father went to his dojo and I could only watch. I made no progress, and I gained no deeper understanding. Even though the rest of my body was fine, all those people forced me to stay still, to heal myself. They said that even my father, that man who tried hard to train every day, told me to sit and do nothing. Midline horizontal ellipsis. I had no escape and no way to improve. That feeling of constant concentration and pressure was gone. Even though I sat all day doing nothing, I had lost my balance. Maybe it was an illusion, but I almost felt like I was disintegrating through those days. I couldn't do anything. I had nothing after all. There was nothing for me to do in my life other than training. 10 days passed by, fast and slow. I wasted them sleeping, sitting, and watching Nina train. After that incredible night, I finally managed to land a punch on my father. The impact was indescribable, as if I had been given the whole world to snatch from my hands. If those days had continued, I don't know what I would have done, but Nina helped me keep my feet on the ground. She gave me something to focus on. The 10th day of my rest period was much the same. In the morning my father examined my wound again. It had a scab and he said it was healing well, but it would be another 10 days or so before I could train again. He said there couldn't be any disturbances, and he said I probably wouldn't stop even when I needed to. That's why I wasn't allowed to train. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. Hours later, with the bright blue sky above, I was sitting on the porch. Nina was in front of me, brandishing a sword. She had arrived early that day, with some emotion in her eyes that I couldn't identify. Worry? Maybe. I don't know what she looked like. I didn't like to think about how bad I felt after those days without being able to train. I imagined it was something similar to what an addict feels, separated from his vice. I let out a deep sigh, being careful not to move the bandages that surrounded my chest and shoulder. Nina, standing under the sunlight in the center of the snowy courtyard, used her real sword that day. It was all heavy metal in her hands, not like the wooden swords we trained with. I didn't know when she had started using the normal-sized adult sword, but the weapon was a meter long. She handled it with ease, moving from a high stance to a mid-guard, her body always moving, taking a step at full speed. She stabbed the sword in front of her before putting it back in place, the snow on the ground cracking beneath her feet. Nina's technique was impeccable. She moved with a firm stance that denoted many years of practice. No one could become so familiar with the sword god style unless they had spent their entire life studying it. Nina had been born with a sword in her hands and had dedicated her entire life to nothing else. An 11-year-old girl who had dedicated her entire life to a single art, a bloody art. I shifted in my seat, my back leaning against the wall of my house as I watched her. I was sitting on a small porch, just under the roof. The old wood was cold beneath me. Normally, I could warm up by exercising, but I was supposed to keep resting. If I tried to do anything, Nina would stop me. The cold summer air bit my skin. I looked inside my body with nothing else to do. The cold air pulled at me, drawing out that energy, my tuki, the electricity that was springing from somewhere deep inside me. The cold wind was reduced thanks to my tuki. Maybe that day, after 10 days of stagnation, I would find something new. How curious. When I try to do a good reading, the views of this bonnet go down. But in the chapter of the 5th birthday this thing went off. Not a comment. Well, now I know what my dear readers want. Hashtag chapter 20 Sword Saint Par 3. I closed my eyes to focus on the heat. I found it easy to fall into a meditative state. I had learned to silence my thoughts and focus entirely on the feeling of living with my body. But meditation wasn't exactly what I did, sitting on that porch on that 10th day. The forest below me, Nina practicing sword strokes, the wall at my back. It hit me like a bolt of lightning, fallen from the sky. I could feel the inside of my hands. It wasn't skin or air covering my body. It was deeper than I should have been able to feel, deeper than the nervous system could touch. I could feel an inner core. I could make out the structure of the bones in my palm. It was strange, but not unpleasant. Questions gnawed at my mind. What was this? Was it my tuki? I opened my eyes and raised both hands. I could feel the connection between the bones in my fingers. I could feel the pulse of the veins in my wrists. It was all there, right beneath me, my flesh and my blood. It was me. But that wasn't what I focused on. There was another layer, beyond the physical, more than I could see. I closed my eyes again. It was invisible. Maybe it wasn't even there, not in a sense of real or unreal, but something completely different, magical. I shouldn't have been able to feel it, but I did. In my old world, I wouldn't have felt anything at all, but here, I could feel it here. It was a part of me, as sure as all the flesh and blood in my body. It was the electricity, the thing that pulsed through my bones, surging when I needed it most. It was the thing that blocked out the world. It enveloped my skin and my fingers, flowing outward, pulsing from the very core of my body. Even though I couldn't see it, it heated me, an electromagnetic wave coiling around itself and forming a barrier. Or maybe a better description. It formed an aura, my tuki just above my skin, penetrating my body completely. I was protected. With a blink, I realized I could no longer feel the pain in my shoulder. I stood up from the wooden bench. Nina, I called out to her. She turned to look at me and her sword fell from a ready position. What? Are you restless? She said with a mocking smile. I ignored the comment. Those long days had tested my patience, and I was sure she derived some sort of perverse joy from seeing me unable to practice. I'm ready to train again, I said, sounding serious. Think. She raised an eyebrow at this. I don't think so, Gino. Wasn't it this morning that your father said it would take a couple more days? She said. I just discovered something. I'm fine now, I mumbled. I put a hand on my injured shoulder, slowly turning my arm and raising it above my head. It felt perfect, like nothing had happened. I was only half focused on the conversation. The feeling in my hands, on my skin, all over my body, was too distracting. I stood on my toes, stretching my ankles as I balanced on the balls of my feet. It felt like a weight had just been lifted off me, like I had been under a huge burden, only to leave it behind. I need to try it. Do you want to train? The words came out of my mouth. She looked at me with narrowed eyes. Yeah, sure, now I'm curious, she said. It took me only a moment to pull out a wooden training sword from inside. Nina hadn't brought a wooden sword of her own, so I grabbed another one for her. I tossed the training sword to her, and she left the sheathed steel one lying in the snow. Your dad isn't going to yell at me, right? Are you fully healed? She muttered. Yes, I replied dryly. I was watching her. She was still hesitating, looking at me uneasily. Her posture was totally wrong. Where was that iron column I had seen the last 10 days? I wanted to experience that. I wanted to fight my father. Again too. She moved her sword under my gaze, before raising her sword. I was ready. Gino, is everything okay? Nina's voice echoed in the courtyard. Yes, I replied. The world froze. I was watching her, watching the movements of her legs, the trembling of her heels as she slowly lowered her weight, ready to pounce on me. I could see the flow of energy through her body. I could see the intent behind her sword. I took a step forward. For the second time in 10 days, my world lit up. I rested my sword at the base of my neck. Midline horizontal ellipsis, I looked up. She was still taller than me, maybe a few centimeters. She hadn't moved her sword at all. She had barely changed her stance. I reached her before the energy in her body had a chance to flow. Her eyes met mine. After a second, her lips curved upwards. I'm not sure how to describe the emotion on her face though. It didn't look like happiness. Maybe at first glance, it could have been mistaken for a smile, but it wasn't. It looked like she was in pain. Even though she was smiling and her eyes were wrinkled, it looked like someone had just cut her with a sword. I was sure I hadn't hurt her. My sword was made of wood and hadn't even touched her skin. I stopped my attack just before I reached her neck. Even then, the sword was floating right above her. So, why did she look like that? It wasn't anger at me hitting her. I knew what that looked like. It always made her storm off, and then the next day she was fine again. It wasn't frustration or anger at me. I'd seen all of that. I walked away and dropped my sword. The energy, my tuki, coursed through my body. I could feel it everywhere in my body, in my blood, and in my bones. It coiled around my skin and protected me. Maybe it was always there, but when I sat on that porch and fought my father, I finally learned to see it. I could never unsee it. That energy would stay with me for the rest of my life. In my flesh and blood, it was a part of me. I looked at Nina. She was shaking. I think it was the adrenaline, or maybe the euphoria of that fight. Nina's fake smile was still there. That indescribable emotion was still clear on her face. That was the day I truly became a sword saint, the day I learned to see and use my tuki. It was also a day I could have learned something important about people, but I missed the chance. I had the opportunity to approach her, ask her a question, and offer some kind of comfort as a friend. Instead, for the second time in 10 days, I couldn't help but laugh. I felt amazing that Nina POV her cousin was a sword saint. That was the first thought in her head when she felt the sword against her throat. Nina Ferrio learned an important lesson at that moment. She was 11 years old, beyond the mountains in the far north, where the 3 magical kingdoms had no reach. Not that age mattered in that place. This was the holy land of the sword. There nothing else was important but skill. Nina had never known a different culture. She was of the blood of the sword god, and she dedicated herself to her training like a fish in water, swimming against the current towards mastery from the moment she first held a sword. All the teachers agreed that she was meant to be there. She was a prodigy. But the girl remained kind and humble throughout her childhood when others might have become ill-tempered rebels. Despite all the praise, she never developed an ego. After all, She had to face the crushing reality of Genobritz's every day. That reality kept her grounded. It was a stabilizing force in her life, something she could never escape. She couldn't remember the first time she met Geno, no matter how far back she looked. He was there. His father was a direct disciple of her father, and his mother, her aunt. Their families were bound by blood and sword. Nina was a friendly girl, and despite her great ability, she was down to earth and reliable. Other children could bring their problems to her. She surrounded herself with friends, and in the training dojos, she was a leader. She poured her heart out to her close friends, without holding anything back. The boy was her opposite. He was different from the other children. He was less of an equal and more of an object to be avoided. When a child saw Genobritzes running through the city on one of his morning runs, he would lower his head and look away. This doesn't mean that Geno was violent or a bully. The problem was deeper, and it was a question of understanding. The other children did not understand Geno. Nina didn't think he would notice. She never talked about it. She never expressed that she liked him, and she decided to wait until they were both adults. He would disappear into the woods on random days. Without warning, he would wander off, and she would have to follow his footprints for hours to find him. Those footprints always led to some hidden, snowy clearing. He always swung his sword in silence. That silence always surrounded him. She was his only friend, and she was proud of it. Even though she might not fully understand Geno, she did understand what he loved. He loved swords, and so did she, more than anything else, and that made her happy. Genobritzes is her cousin, her friend, and the person she loves. He was different from her, and maybe from everyone, but that wasn't what made him scary. Good job, Geno. Her voice came out of her mouth. He was a few steps away from her, in the empty training yard behind her house. Geno was 3 years younger than her and had already completely surpassed her. Sword Saint Par 3. I closed my eyes to focus on the heat. I found it easy to fall into a meditative state. I had learned to silence my thoughts and focus entirely on the feeling of living with my body. But meditation wasn't exactly what I did, sitting on that porch on that 10th day. The forest below me, Nina practicing sword strokes, the wall at my back. It hit me like a bolt of lightning, fallen from the sky. I could feel the inside of my hands. It wasn't skin or air covering my body. It was deeper than I should have been able to feel, deeper than the nervous system could touch. I could feel an inner core. I could make out the structure of the bones in my palm. It was strange, but not unpleasant. Questions gnawed at my mind. What was this? Was it my tuki? I opened my eyes and raised both hands. I could feel the connection between the bones in my fingers. I could feel the pulse of the veins in my wrists. It was all there, right beneath me, my flesh and my blood. It was me. But that wasn't what I focused on. There was another layer, beyond the physical, more than I could see. I closed my eyes again. It was invisible. Maybe it wasn't even there, not in a sense of real or unreal, but something completely different, magical. I shouldn't have been able to feel it, but I did. In my old world, I wouldn't have felt anything at all, but here, I could feel it here. It was a part of me, as sure as all the flesh and blood in my body. It was the electricity, the thing that pulsed through my bones, surging when I needed it most. It was the thing that blocked out the world. It enveloped my skin and my fingers, flowing outward, pulsing from the very core of my body. Even though I couldn't see it, it heated me, an electromagnetic wave coiling around itself and forming a barrier. Or maybe a better description. It formed an aura, my tuki just above my skin, penetrating my body completely. I was protected. With a blink, I realized I could no longer feel the pain in my shoulder. I stood up from the wooden bench. Nina. I called out to her. She turned to look at me. And her sword fell from a ready position. What? Are you restless? She said with a mocking smile. I ignored the comment. Those long days had tested my patience, and I was sure she derived some sort of perverse joy from seeing me unable to practice. I'm ready to train again, I said, sounding serious. Think. She raised an eyebrow at this. I don't think so, Geno. Wasn't it this morning that your father said it would take a couple more days? She said. I I just discovered something, I'm fine now, I mumbled. I put a hand on my injured shoulder, slowly turning my arm and raising it above my head. It felt perfect, like nothing had happened. I was only half focused on the conversation. The feeling in my hands, on my skin, all over my body, was too distracting. I stood on my toes, stretching my ankles as I balanced on the balls of my feet. It felt like a weight had just been lifted off me, like I had been under a huge burden, only to leave it behind. I need to try it. Do you want to train? The words came out of my mouth. She looked at me with narrowed eyes. Yeah, sure, now I'm curious, she said. It took me only a moment to pull out a wooden training sword from inside. Nina hadn't brought a wooden sword of her own, so I grabbed another one for her. I tossed the training sword to her, and she left the sheathed steel one lying in the snow. Your dad isn't going to yell at me, right? Are you fully healed? She muttered. Yes, I replied dryly. I was watching her. She was still hesitating, looking at me uneasily. Her posture was totally wrong. Where was that iron column I had seen the last 10 days? I wanted to experience that. I wanted to fight my father again too. She moved her sword under my gaze, before raising her sword. I was ready. Gino, is everything okay? Nina's voice echoed in the courtyard. Yes, I replied. The world froze. I was watching her, watching the movements of her legs, the trembling of her heels as she slowly lowered her weight, ready to pounce on me. I could see the flow of energy through her body. I could see the intent behind her sword. I took a step forward. For the second time in 10 days, my world lit up. I rested my sword at the base of my neck. Midline horizontal ellipsis, I looked up. She was still taller than me, maybe a few centimeters. She hadn't moved her sword at all. She had barely changed her stance. I reached her before the energy in her body had a chance to flow. Her eyes met mine. After a second, her lips curved upwards. I'm not sure how to describe the emotion on her face though. It didn't look like happiness. Maybe at first glance, it could have been mistaken for a smile, but it wasn't. It looked like she was in pain. Even though she was smiling and her eyes were wrinkled, it looked like someone had just cut her with a sword. I was sure I hadn't hurt her. My sword was made of wood and hadn't even touched her skin. I stopped my attack just before I reached her neck. Even then, the sword was floating right above her. So, why did she look like that? It wasn't anger at me hitting her. I knew what that looked like. It always made her storm off, and then the next day she was fine again. It wasn't frustration or anger at me. I'd seen all of that. I walked away and dropped my sword. The energy, my tuki, coursed through my body. I could feel it everywhere in my body, in my blood, and in my bones. It coiled around my skin and protected me. Maybe it was always there, but when I sat on that porch and fought my father, I finally learned to see it. I could never unsee it. That energy would stay with me for the rest of my life. In my flesh and blood, it was a part of me. I looked at Nina. She was shaking. I think it was the adrenaline, or maybe the euphoria of that fight. Nina's fake smile was still there. That indescribable emotion was still clear on her face. That was the day I truly became a sword saint, the day I learned to see and use my tuki. It was also a day I could have learned something important about people, but I missed the chance. I had the opportunity to approach her, ask her a question, and offer some kind of comfort as a friend. Instead, for the second time in 10 days, I couldn't help but laugh. I felt amazing that Nina POV her cousin was a sword saint. That was the first thought in her head when she felt the sword against her throat. Nina Ferrio learned an important lesson at that moment. She was 11 years old, beyond the mountains in the far north, where the 3 magical kingdoms had no reach. Not that age mattered in that place. This was the holy land of the sword. There nothing else was important but skill. Nina had never known a different culture. She was of the blood of the sword god, and she dedicated herself to her training like a fish in water, swimming against the current towards mastery, from the moment she first held a sword. All the teachers agreed that she was meant to be there. She was a prodigy. But the girl remained kind and humble throughout her childhood when others might have become ill-tempered rebels. Despite all the praise, She never developed an ego. After all, she had to face the crushing reality of Genobritzes every day. That reality kept her grounded. It was a stabilizing force in her life, something she could never escape. She couldn't remember the first time she met Geno, no matter how far back she looked. He was there. His father was a direct disciple of her father, and his mother, her aunt. Their families were bound by blood and sword. Nina was a friendly girl, and despite her great ability, she was down to earth and reliable. Other children could bring their problems to her. She surrounded herself with friends, and in the training dojos, she was a leader. She poured her heart out to her close friends, without holding anything back. The boy was her opposite. He was different from the other children. He was less of an equal and more of an object to be avoided. When a child saw Genobritzes running through the city on one of his morning runs, he would lower his head and look away. This doesn't mean that Geno was violent or a bully. The problem was deeper, and it was a question of understanding. The other children did not understand Geno. Nina didn't think he would notice. She never talked about it. She never expressed that she liked him, and she decided to wait until they were both adults. He would disappear into the woods on random days. Without warning, he would wander off, and she would have to follow his footprints for hours to find him. Those footprints always led to some hidden, snowy clearing. He always swung his sword in silence. That silence always surrounded him. She was his only friend, and she was proud of it. Even though she might not fully understand Geno, she did understand what he loved. He loved swords, and so did she, more than anything else, and that made her happy. Genobritzes is her cousin, her friend, and the person she loves. He was different from her, and maybe from everyone, but that wasn't what made him scary. Good job, Geno. Her voice came out of her mouth. He was a few steps away from her, in the empty training yard behind her house. Geno was 3 years younger than her and had already completely surpassed her. Chapter 1 to 20 is ended, and next chapter 21 to 40 is here. Thanks for watching. If you want to suggest me anything, please comment. Thank you.